A gunshot cracks down a street of mud, and the man who drops isn't the woman. He clutches his shoulder, blinking like the dark itself just bit him. 5 men, 1 revolver, and a small, precise click the cylinder, turning right on rhythm. Not half a second wasted. Who taught her to do that? One by one, the lamps in the windows go out. Nobody comes outside. In this camp, folks pull a curtain faster than they'd pull a trigger. Higher up the ridge, the first pickaxe of the morning bites into rock. Steady, unhurried, as if nothing down here were happening at all. Wind comes off the line, where clean white shirts still hang, and carries the smell of powder with it. She steps back once, then stops. Behind her stands a boy of 14, and her finger closes down a third time. The gulch breathes smoke before it breathes anything else. Coal smoke first, then wood smoke, then the sour reek of men who haven't seen a real bath since Cheyenne, since the railroad, since some other life they gave up chasing a color that doesn't exist in the ground any more than it exists in a dream. Deadwood doesn't wake up. It just stops pretending to sleep. Somewhere past 4 in the morning, the last drunk stumbles out of the last saloon. Somewhere past 5, the first pickaxe bites rock. And in between, there's maybe an hour, maybe less, where the whole gulch just sits there in the dark breathing. Autumn, 1876. The gold has slowed, but the men haven't. If anything, they're worse now. Hungrier, meaner, because the easy color is gone. The placer gold that used to sit right there in the creek bed, like pennies dropped by a careless god. That's gone. Panned out. Picked clean. What's left now takes digging, takes blasting, takes men willing to go underground and stay there, and men willing to lie about what they find when they come back up. This is not a town. Not yet. It doesn't have the right to call itself one. There's no marshal sent by Washington. No judge with a real gavel. No deed office with a real seal. Because the land underneath every last one of these buildings still belongs, on paper, in treaty, in a promise the government made, and is already quietly deciding not to keep, to the Lakota. Everyone here knows it. Nobody here cares. They built anyway. Streets of mud and rot wood plank. Sassoons stacked against assay offices, stacked against tents that never got upgraded to anything better. And over the whole ramshackle mess, a council. Not a government. A council. Miners who elected themselves judge and jury because somebody had to, and the somebody who usually ended up with the job was whoever had the most money to spread around. Which is a nice way of saying whoever Gideon Pratt wanted. But that's later. Right now, in the gray hour before the gulch wakes, there is a small clapboard building at the low end of Main Street, canted 3 degrees off true, because nothing in this town was built level. And behind it, over a washpot already boiling, steam rising into the cold like a ghost trying to leave a body, there is a woman. She is 26 years old, smaller than people expect. 5'3" in boots rosoled twice, hands red and cracked from lye soap and hot water, sleeves rolled to the elbow, dark hair pinned back so tight it looks like it's trying to disappear. She moves like someone who decided, a long time ago, on purpose, to take up as little space as a grown woman possibly can. Her name is Temperance Ashford. Ask anyone on this street. The miners hauling water, the freighters cursing their mules, the boys sweeping the boardwalk outside the mercantile. Ask any one of them who Temperance Ashford is, and they'll tell you the same thing. The widow. Does the wash? That's the whole of it. That's all she is to Deadwood. A woman who takes your filthy shirts and gives them back clean. Who charges fair. Who doesn't talk much. Who lost her husband to something sudden and sad last winter and never remarried. Never even seemed to look at another man twice. Quiet as held breath. Small as a secret kept so long it's stopped feeling like a secret at all. Which is exactly what she wants them to think. Because there's a false bottom in the trunk under her bed. And beneath the false bottom there's a strip of oiled canvas. And wrapped inside the canvas is a Colt Navy revolver that hasn't fired a shot since the day Ezekiel Ashford put it in her hands and said, in that low, careful voice, he saved only for the things that mattered again. She doesn't think about that. Not this morning. Not most mornings. She's trained herself the way you train a dog off a bad habit. Sharp correction. Every time, the second the thought raises its head. Don't. Not now. Wash pot's boiling. So she doesn't think about the gun. She thinks about lie. About the Hendricks account. 4 shirts and a coat, due Thursday. About the boy, not her boy. Never her boy by blood, but the only boy she has left in this world. Still asleep in the back room, 14 years old and growing out of his boots again. She thinks about anything. Anything but the gun. Until the wash pot boils over, and she jumps back with a hiss, and somewhere down the street, a rooster that has no business being in a gold camp crows, like it's mocking her. And the sun finally clears the ridge and throws its first hard light down into Deadwood Gulch. Another day. Same as the last one. She tells herself that. She's wrong. The wash house smells like her whole life. Lye and steam and the particular mineral funk of creek water. Temperance moves through the morning the way she moves through every morning. Economical, unhurried on the surface. Exact underneath. Boil. Scrub. Wring. Hang. The line out back already half full. Shirts and long johns and one enormous pair of miner's canvas trousers snapping stiff in the cold wind coming down off the ridge. She works down the line item by item, wooden pins between her teeth, and if you watched her long enough, really watched her. Not the way this town watches anything. You might notice something odd. The way she never turns her back fully to the street. The way her eyes track movement. Quick. Automatic. Before she even registers she's doing it. A wagon passing. A dog barking. A man laughing too loud outside the Bella Union 3 doors down. Each one gets half a second of her attention. Cataloged, dismissed, and she goes back to the wash. It isn't fear. It's readiness. There's a difference. And if you'd asked her, which nobody does, because nobody asks the widow who does the wash about anything, except whether her rates have gone up, she couldn't have told you when the readiness became a habit, so old it felt like breathing, except she knows exactly when. 9 years old. Missouri, a father 3 months dead in a war that took the wrong men and left the wrong ones. A mother remarried to a man with hard hands. And a boy 2 farms over, 17, and already broad through the shoulders, who used to walk the fence line with an old cavalry pistol, and let her watch him strip it down and put it back together, over and over, until her small hands could do it faster than his big ones. You've got the hands for it, he told her once. Steadier than mine. That boy became a man. That man became her husband. And somewhere in the years between, Kansas, then the trail west, then this gulch full of mud and greed, he made her promise something. Never let him see it. Not unless you got no other choice left. A skill nobody knows you have is worth 10 times the one they're watching for. She'd laughed at him then. Told him he sounded like a man in a dime novel. He hadn't laughed back. I mean it, Temperance. World's got a way of finding out exactly what you're worth to it, and taking the rest. She hangs the last shirt, presses her palm flat against her apron, once, like she's smoothing down something that isn't there. 14 months since they buried him. The wind changes. Somewhere down toward Main Street, a man's voice rises, sharp and mean, cutting through the general gulch. Noise the way a knife cuts through canvas, and Temperance's hands go still on the clothesline. Not fear. Readiness. She just doesn't know yet what she's getting ready for. 2 years earlier, a homestead claim north of the gulch, before the gulch was anything at all. The light is different in memory. Softer. Gold, in a way the actual gold in this ground never quite manages to be. Ezekiel Ashford stands at the tree line with his coat off, despite the chill, sleeves rolled, and in front of him, feet planted wrong, shoulders too tight, jaw set with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has just missed a bottle on a fence post for the 4th time, stands his wife. You're anticipating the kick, he says. I am not. You are. I watch your shoulder come up before your finger. Even Ezekiel Ashford, I have been shooting since before you knew my name. Shooting at what? Turkeys? Turkeys don't shoot back, Tempe. That lands. She lowers the pistol, and for a second the stubbornness cracks into something rawer. Something scared. And he sees it, and immediately regrets the joke. Hey, he says. Softer now. Crosses the distance between them in 4 long steps, and puts his hand over hers on the grip, not taking the gun, just steadying it. Hey, look at me. She does. Nobody's shooting at you today. Nobody's ever going to. If I've got any say-says in it. But I've got a bad feeling about this territory. Everybody's crazy for that Black Hills color, and crazy men make for lawless towns, and I need to know. I need to know that if I'm not there. If I'm not fast enough, or lucky enough, or God forbid I'm just not there, don't. I need to know you can put a man down and reload before your hands even think to shake. That's not turkey shooting. That's the only kind of shooting that keeps you breathing. Her jaw sets again, but it's a different kind of set now. Not stubborn. Resolved. Then teach me, she says. All of it. Every ugly part. He does. Months of it. Draw and fire. Draw and fire under pressure. Him shouting nonsense at her. Banging a pot lid. Anything to break her concentration. Because real trouble won't wait for you to feel ready. Reload with numb fingers in the cold. Reload in the dark by feel alone, 6 brass cylinders sliding home like a rosary counted blind. He teaches her to read a man's shoulders before his hand moves, to count another shooter's fired rounds without meaning to, the number just sitting there in the back of her mind, like a held breath, to choose, every single time, before her hand ever closes around the grip. Is this the moment, or isn't it? Because the gun that comes out too easy is the gun that gets you killed. And the gun that stays holstered 1 second too long does the exact same thing. By the end of that summer, she doesn't miss the bottle on the fence post anymore. By the end of that summer, Ezekiel Ashford looks at his wife, loading a Colt Navy with hands that don't shake, and there's something in his face that isn't pride, exactly. It's closer to grief. Like he's already looking at a version of her he hopes she never has to become. Better than me, he says quietly. God help whoever makes you use it. She'd laughed at that too. She isn't laughing anymore. Not in the memory, and not now, 14 months later, standing over a washpot with her hands gone still on a clothesline. Because somewhere down Main Street a man's voice is getting closer, and it is not a friendly voice, and Temperance Ashford feels the old readiness rise up through her like heat off a stove. They married the spring after that summer of practiced shots and pot-lid ambushes, in a Missouri church with a leaking roof and 6 guests, because that's all either of them had left to invite. No father to walk her down anything. No mother who'd have come even if asked. Just a boy she'd known since she was 9, standing at the front in a borrowed coat, looking at her like she was the only solid thing left standing, in a world that had taken almost everything else. I've got nothing to offer you, Ezekiel told her the night before, sitting on a fence rail under a sky gone thick with stars. Nothing but a strong back and a stubborn streak, and a promise I mean to keep, which promise? That I'll never once let you feel like you belong to me. Only with me. There's a difference, Tempe, and I aim to spend my whole life proving I know it. She'd married him for less romantic words than that. Plenty of women had, but those were the words that stayed with her, turned over in her mind on hard nights. Because he kept the promise. Every single year of it. Right up until the year he didn't get the chance to keep anything at all. They came west, the way half of Missouri came west that decade, which is to say badly, and slowly, and with far less certainty than the word pioneer ever implied. A wagon that broke an axle outside of Hays. A winter spent in a soddy in Kansas that nearly finished them both before spring ever showed its face. Ezekiel worked cattle 2 seasons to save enough for the next leg of the journey. And Temperance took in mending for ranch wives who paid in eggs and flour more often than coin, and neither of them once complained where the other could hear it, because complaining, they'd both learned early. In their separate hard childhoods, before they ever found each other, complaining was a thing you could only afford, once you'd already lost the fight. They heard about the Black Hills, the way everyone heard about the Black Hills. Rumor first. Then a newspaper column, somebody's neighbor, had somebody read aloud outside the mercantile. Then, finally, the particular fever that takes hold of tired, hopeful men everywhere once the word gold gets loose in the air and starts breeding certainty out of nothing but want. Ezekiel didn't want the gold. Not really. Told her so plain, more than once, sitting across a campfire, somewhere on the long haul north. Don't need to strike anything, he said. Just need ground of our own. Someplace nobody with more money than sense can come along and decide belongs to them instead. He didn't live to see whether that hope was foolish. They reached the Gulch in the spring of 1875, before the real rush hit, before 10,000 strangers turned a gold camp into something that only pretended, on its better days, to resemble a town. Staked no claim of their own, because Ezekiel had already seen enough, by then, of what claims cost men who held them, and instead they built the wash house at the low end of Main Street, canted 3 degrees off, true same as everything else. Because there is always money, Ezekiel liked to say, in cleaning up after other men's ambition, and it is a great deal safer work than chasing ambition of your own. Micah came to them that same first winter. Not their blood, not exactly. A nephew twice removed on Ezekiel's side, whose own parents hadn't survived a fever that swept through a wagon train somewhere back along the trail, and neither Temperance nor Ezekiel ever discussed the decision out loud so much as simply made it. The way you make a decision that was never really a decision at all. More a fact you were only waiting for the world to hand you. Family, Ezekiel said. The first night the boys slept under their roof, curled small, and grieving in a bed too big for him, is the people you decide to keep. Blood's got nothing to do with the deciding part. She'd thought, watching her husband say that she had never loved anyone the way she loved him in that exact moment. She thinks of it now, standing over her washpot 14 months after burying him, and the memory sits in her chest less like grief and more like a coal that never fully went out, banked low, waiting only for enough air to remember how to burn. The washhouse door hangs a little crooked, same as everything else in Deadwood, and it doesn't so much open as get shoved. Hard enough that the top hinge screams and a jar of clothespins jumps off the shelf and shatters on the floor. Micah is already awake. 14. Gangly in the way boys get right before they stop being boys. Hair that never sits right no matter how many times Temperance wets it down. He comes out of the back room, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and freezes in the doorway. Because there is a man filling up the front of the washhouse who has no business being this close to sunrise sober, let alone whatever he is instead. "Ma'am," the man says. Doesn't sound like a greeting. Sounds like a warning wrapped in manners. The way a rattlesnake sounds like music if you don't know better. Temperance doesn't turn around right away. Finishes pinning the shirt in her hand. Counts 3 seconds she doesn't need to count, because she already knows exactly who's standing in her doorway before she's laid eyes on him. The whole gulch knows that voice. Low and unhurried. The voice of man who has never once in his life needed to raise it to be heard. Jubal Creed. She turns. Not what the dime novels would make him. No black hat. No silver, spurs jingling like a warning bell. Just a tall man in a plain gray coat, gone thin at the elbows, hat pulled low, 2 Colts worn low and forward on his hips in a way that isn't for show. It's for speed. His face is the kind that might have been handsome once, before something in it hardened permanent, like clay left too long in a kiln. He's maybe 35. He's killed, the town says, 11 men. The town, being the town, is probably wrong. It's probably more. Behind him, 2 more men crowd the doorway. Pratt's men. Everybody knows Pratt's men the way everybody knows a particular breed of dog. Not by the face, but by the way they hold themselves. The way they take up room they haven't earned. "Mr. Creed," Temperance says. Her voice comes out level. She's pleased with that, distantly, the way you'd be pleased with a horse that didn't spook at a gunshot. "Washhouse doesn't open till 7. Didn't come for laundry." "No," she says. "I don't suppose you did." A silence. "Not long. Long enough." Micah takes a half step forward, chin up, 14 years old, and doing his very best impression of a man ready to defend something, and Temperance's hand finds his shoulder without her even looking, presses him back. Firm. "Not now. I've got business with Mr. Pratt," Creed says. "Which means I've got business with you." "I don't know Mr. Pratt." "Funny. He knows you." Outside, the street has started to notice. A door creaks open across the way. A woman with a market basket slows her step, then stops entirely, pretending very hard to be interested in something on the ground. Deadwood doesn't have much entertainment before 8 in the morning, and a feared gunslinger standing in the widow's washhouse doorway is shaping up to be the best show in town. "There's a marker," Creed says. "Card table, Bella Union, back room. 6 months back. Your husband held it when he paused, deliberate. A blade turned slow in a wound just to watch the reaction when he passed. Something in Temperance's chest goes very still. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. I think," she says. And her voice doesn't shake, doesn't rise. Stays exactly, precisely level. "That you should leave my property." Creed doesn't move, doesn't reach for anything. He doesn't have to. Being Jubal Creed is a kind of weapon all its own. The simple fact of his presence doing work that a drawn gun couldn't. "Mr. Pratt would consider it a courtesy," he says, "if that marker found its way back to him today." "I have no marker." "Then you won't mind if we look." And that is the moment Temperance Ashford makes a mistake she will spend the rest of that day regretting, because she steps sideways, blocking the doorframe with her small body, like it means something, like it could possibly stop what's about to happen. And she says, quiet but sharp as a needle, "You are not coming into my home." Jubal Creed looks at her for a long moment. Something crosses his face. Not cruelty, not exactly. Something closer to recognition. The way you might look twice at a word you can almost remember the meaning of. Then it's gone. "Sorry, ma'am," he says. And he doesn't sound sorry at all. Wasn't a request. What happens next takes 11 seconds. Temperance will count them later, alone, replaying it. 11 seconds, start to finish, and by the end of it, half of Deadwood's Main Street is standing in the mud outside her wash house watching. Creed's hand, not drawing, never drawing. That would be too much, too permanent, and Gideon Pratt's instructions were clear. On this point, Creed's hand simply closes on the washtub full of scalded linens, sitting on the porch rail. The one Temperance spent the last hour boiling and wringing and pinning, and with a motion so casual it barely counts as violence, he tips it over the rail into the mud. White shirts. Someone's good church coat. A tablecloth belonging to the doctor's wife, embroidered by hand, ruined in an instant, soaking dark and filthy in the street. "Careless of me," Creed says, not looking at the ruined wash, looking only at Temperance. "Clumsy hands. Man like me, ma'am. He ought to be more careful around delicate things." One of Pratt's other men laughs. "It's an ugly sound." "You'll pay for that," Temperance says, and her voice, for the first time, shakes. Not from fear, though the crowd watching will assume that's exactly what it is, but from a fury so total and so sudden, it frightens even her. "Will I?" Creed steps closer, close enough that she has to tip her chin up to hold his eyes, and she does. Doesn't flinch, doesn't step back, and something about that, the not flinching, makes his own gaze narrow, just slightly, like a man noticing a draft in a room he thought was sealed. "Your husband," he says, low now, meant only for her, though the street is close enough to catch most of it anyway. "Your husband owed Mr. Pratt an honest debt. Died before he could settle it. Now most men, ma'am, most decent men, they'd say a debt dies with the man." He leans in, close enough she can smell tobacco and horse, and something colder underneath. Something like the inside of a gun barrel. "Mr. Pratt isn't most men. Neither," Temperance says, "was my husband." For just a moment, one single, unguarded moment, something flickers behind Jubal Creed's eyes. Not anger. Something closer to a memory trying to surface through deep water. Some name almost recalled. And it's there and gone so fast that Temperance, still shaking with rage, doesn't even register it happened. 3 days, Creed says, straightening, all business again, all cold performance for the crowd that's gathered thick enough now to be a genuine audience. You bring that marker to Mr. Pratt inside 3 days. Or Mr. Pratt starts wondering what else this washhouse might be hiding. And a man who wonders, ma'am, he tips his hat, mockery dressed up as courtesy. A man who wonders tends to go looking. He turns, walks away unhurried, the crowd parting for him the way water parts for a stone dropped from a height, and his 2 men follow. And within a minute the street has gone back, mostly, to pretending nothing happened at all. Because that's the other thing about Deadwood. Nobody wants to be the next person Jubal Creed remembers by name. Temperance stands in the mud in front of her ruined wash. The tablecloth, the church coat, somebody's good shirts, filthy now, ruined, and she'll have to make it right out of her own thin pocket. Because that's what a laundress does. That's what a widow does. Absorbs the cost of every careless hand that ever touched her life and says nothing. Asks for nothing. Expects nothing. Because that's the arithmetic this whole gulch has quietly agreed to run on. A woman alone pays first every single time, and this town calls the paying good manners. She's done that arithmetic for 14 months straight. She's about to stop. Micah is at her side. His face is white with a 14-year-old's particular helpless rage. The kind that has nowhere to go. No fist big enough. No gun steady enough. Nothing but the terrible knowledge of being too young and too small in a moment that demanded neither. Aunt Tempe inside, she says. But inside, Micah. He goes. She doesn't. She stands there one moment longer in the ruined mud, in front of the whole watching street, small and quiet, and utterly, publicly humiliated, and something in her chest that has been asleep for 14 months. Longer, if she's honest. Opens one eye. Not now, she tells it. For once, it doesn't listen. By noon, the story has already traveled the length of Main Street twice over, gaining details it never earned along the way. the way stories do in a gulch with nothing better to occupy its idle mouths. At the Mercantile, two women who've never once bought so much as a handkerchief from each other trade the tale back and forth like a hand of cards, each one adding a flourish the last teller missed. Did you hear? Right there in the mud. Jubal Creed himself, mind you, not some hired boy. And her standing there like she'd swallowed a fence post, didn't even cry, which some of them will call brave later, once the shape of the story finishes changing, and some of them will call unnatural, because a proper widow is supposed to cry, isn't she? Supposed to look small and broken in exactly the way this town has decided grief ought to look. At the Bella Union, a miner who saw the whole thing from the boardwalk describes it 3 separate times to 3 separate audiences before supper, and by the third telling the washpot has become 2 washpots, and Temperance has become, in his retelling, considerably more frightened than she ever once looked standing in that mud. Nobody, in any of these tellings, thinks to ask why Jubal Creed came asking after a gambling marker from a woman whose husband, as far as this whole gulch ever knew, never once sat down at a card table in his life. That's the thing about a town with no real law in it. It develops, instead, a kind of collective forgetting, convenient and unspoken, because asking the wrong question out loud in Deadwood has a way of drawing exactly the kind of attention nobody wants drawn, and so the story gets told and retold and smoothed down at the edges until it fits neatly inside the shape everyone's already decided the widow occupies. Small, quiet, unlucky, a woman things happen to rather than a woman capable of making anything happen back. Inside, the washhouse door shut and barred, Temperance's hands finally start to shake. Not from fear. She's clear on that now. Clearer than she's been about anything in a long, long time. It isn't fear making her hands tremble as she braces them flat against the wash counter and stares down at the water going cold in the basin. It's something with teeth, because she spent 14 months, 14, being small, being quiet, being exactly what this town expects a dead man's widow to be. Grateful for the work, apologetic for existing, invisible enough that nobody looks twice. She built that smallness on purpose, brick by brick. Every time some drunk called her little lady in that voice. Every time the Mercantile owner shorted her on lye soap because he figured she wouldn't count it. Every time, every single time, she swallowed it down and said, "Thank you kindly," and went back to scrubbing. Because Ezekiel told her with his hand over her hand on that revolver grip, a skill nobody knows you have is worth 10 times the one they're watching for. She believed him. She still believes him. Except there is a difference, and she is only now, standing in her own wrecked doorway with someone else's ruined church coat, drying stiff in the mud outside, starting to understand this difference. There is a difference between staying quiet and letting a man like Jubal Creed dump her life into the dirt in front of the whole street and call it clumsy hands, which he did, which everyone saw, which means by supper tonight, every soul on Main Street will have their own version of what happened, and in every version, Temperance Ashford stood there and took it. Small, quiet, exactly the widow they always thought she was. Good, some cold practical part of her says. Let them think that. But another part, older, harder to hear, buried under 14 months of careful smallness, is not so sure anymore that quiet is the same thing as safe. Because what marker? What debt? Because Ezekiel never gambled. Not once in 9 years of marriage did she ever see him lay down more than a nickel bet on a hand of cards. Not because he thought it wicked, but because he'd grown up, watching his own father lose a farm one Saturday night at a time, and swore it off. For life. Swore it to her the week they married, and she believed him the way the sun would rise east, because it was simply, plainly, unshakably true. Until now. Until a man with 2 Colts on his hips stood in her doorway and said the word marker, like it was a fact already settled, which means one of 2 things. Either Jubal Creed is lying, sent by Gideon Pratt to shake loose whatever fear or money he can from a widow too small and too quiet to fight back, or her husband was somewhere, doing something, 6 months before he died, that he never once told her about. Both of those thoughts sit in her chest like stones. She doesn't know which one she's more afraid of. The washpot has gone cold. She should build the fire back up. She should apologize to the doctor's wife for the tablecloth. Should pay out of her own pocket for the church coat. should do all the small, quiet, grateful things a small, quiet, grateful widow is supposed to do the very next morning after being humiliated in the street. She doesn't move, because, and this thought arrives fully formed, unbidden, and frightens her almost as much as Jubal Creed's hand on the washtub did, because there is a trunk under her bed. And under the false bottom of that trunk, wrapped in oiled canvas, there is a revolver that hasn't fired since the last day her husband stood behind her with his hand over her hand and said, "Again." She hasn't touched it since the funeral. She finds herself walking toward the back room before she's decided to. Micah is sitting on the edge of his cot when she comes through, knees drawn up, staring at nothing, and the look on his face stops her cold in the doorway. 14 years old. Shouldn't look like that. Shouldn't have that particular gray, hollowed-out cast around the eyes. The look of someone carrying something they've been carrying alone for far too long, and are about to set down whether they mean to or not. Micah. He doesn't answer right away. Micah, look at me. He does. And what's in his face isn't the leftover fear from watching a man dump her wash into the mud. It's older than that. Deeper. It's been sitting in him, she realizes with a cold drop in her stomach, for a good deal longer than 11 seconds on a front porch. You know something, she says. Not a question. His jaw works. Aunt Tempe, Micah. I should have told you. His voice cracks on the last word. And just like that, he's not doing his brave 14-year-old impression of a man anymore. He's a boy. Scared. And it's the scared that breaks something loose. The night Uncle Zeke, he stops. Starts again the night he died. I wasn't asleep. The room goes very quiet. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog barks twice and stops. I was supposed to be. You'd sent me to bed hours before. But I heard him come in from the Bella Union, real late, and he wasn't Aunt Tempe. He wasn't drunk. I know what drunk sounds like on him, on any man. And this wasn't that. He sounded scared. Scared he was talking to himself. Low. I couldn't hear all of it. Just pieces. Through the wall, he said. Micah screws his eyes shut, dragging the memory up from wherever a 14-year-old buries the worst night of his life. He said, he's going to kill somebody over this. And then he said your name. And then it went quiet, and I figured he'd gone to bed. So I went back to sleep. And in the morning he was dead in his chair. Micah's voice is barely above a whisper now. Doc said his heart just stopped. Said it happens sometimes, even to strong men, even young ones. Said there wasn't a mark on him. There wasn't. But Aunt Tempe, and here, the boy's composure finally fully breaks. Tears standing hot and furious in his eyes. He wasn't scared the night before because his heart was about to give out. Men don't know that's coming. He was scared because of something he'd seen, or done, or won maybe, at that table, something that made somebody dangerous enough to. He can't finish it, doesn't have to. Temperance sits down on the cot beside him, very slowly, the way you'd sit next to something that might shatter if you move too fast. She doesn't touch him, just sits. You should have told me, she says. I know. 14 months, Micah. I know. His voice cracks again. I didn't. I was scared you'd think it was my fault somehow. For not saying something sooner. For not waking you. For not I don't know. I was just scared. And every day it got harder to say it, because every day made it look worse that I hadn't. She's quiet for a long moment. Then she does reach for him. Pulls his head against her shoulder the way she used to, when he was smaller. When Ezekiel was alive, and this was a whole different kind of family. And she feels the boy shake once, hard, and go still. It's not your fault, she says. None of it. Then, whose is it? She doesn't answer that. Because the honest answer, the one forming cold and clear in the back of her mind, right alongside the memory of Jubal Creed's voice saying the word marker like a closing door, is a name she isn't ready to say out loud yet. Not until she's certain. Micah, she says instead. Where's your uncle's good coat? The gray one. The one he wore to town. The boy blinks, thrown by the sudden turn. Trunk, I think. Under the Y. Because I'm going to look at it, Temperance says, standing, and something in her voice has changed. Gone flat and purposeful, in a way Micah has never once heard from her. Not in 14 months of careful smallness. Properly, tonight. She waits until he's asleep, not because she wants to hide anything from him. There'll be no hiding. Not anymore. Not after tonight. She's already decided that much. But because some things a person needs to do alone the first time, before they can stand to have anyone watch. The trunk sits at the foot of her bed, cedar gone dark with age, and inside it, folded with a care she hasn't allowed herself to examine too closely in 14 months, is everything left of Ezekiel Ashford that fits inside a box. His good gray coat, his war medal never worn, kept because a promise made to a dying friend outweighed any feeling about the war itself. A folding knife, a Bible with his mother's handwriting inside the cover. She lifts the coat out first, holds it a moment longer than she needs to, presses it once, briefly, to her face. Wool and tobacco, and something underneath that's just him, still after all this time, and she lets herself have exactly 3 seconds of that, before she makes herself stop. Then she checks the pockets. Nothing in the first, a stub of pencil in the second, gone dry with age. She checked the breast pocket, finds nothing, and is about to fold the coat back into the trunk when her fingers catch on something wrong. A seam that shouldn't sit the way it sits, a stiffness in the lining, just below the collar, that no honest tailoring would put there. Her breath goes short. She carries the coat to the lamp, turns the collar inside out, with hands that have gone very steady, the same steadiness. Ezekiel spent a whole summer drilling into her, and there, sewn shut with small, careful, deliberate stitches, stitches that were never part of the coat's original construction, is a seam that has been opened and closed by hand. By his hand, she realizes. He did this himself. She finds her sewing scissors, cuts the thread with the same care she'd use on a wound, and out of the lining slides a single folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases from being handled, hidden, handled again. Her hands are shaking now. Not the fury shaking from this morning. Something colder. She unfolds it. It's not a gambling marker. Not exactly. There's a marker written across the top. Sure enough, an amount, a date 6 months back, the words paid in full G. Pratt, in a hand she doesn't recognize, followed by a signature that could be Pratt's own, sloppy and rushed. But underneath that, in Ezekiel's careful, patient handwriting, the same handwriting that used to leave grocery lists on the kitchen table, there's more. A list of names. 4 of them. Miners, she realizes, reading closer. Men whose claims sat, one after another over the last 2 years, in a tidy row along the eastern ridge. Beside each name, a date. And beside each date in Ezekiel's own hand, 3 words that stop her heart cold in her chest. Accident. Sold cheap. Pratt bought it. 4 times. The same 3 words 4 times, in her dead husband's handwriting, hidden in the lining of a coat he wore into town the night his own heart supposedly gave out for no reason at all. At the very bottom of the page, in handwriting less steady than the rest, written in a hurry, she thinks, written scared, the way a man writes when he's just understood something he wishes. To God he hadn't. There's one more line. If anything happens to me, go to Duffy. He'll know it's true. Don't trust Pratt. Don't trust anybody wearing his name on their coin. Temperance sits down hard on the edge of the bed, the paper trembling now in hands that have gone from steady to shaking, and back again twice in the space of 1 minute. 14 months. 14 months she believed a sudden, sad, meaningless death. A heart that simply stopped, the way hearts sometimes do, even in strong men, even in young ones. 14 months of being small, being quiet, being exactly what Deadwood expected a grieving widow to be, while the truth sat sewn into a coat lining 8 feet from where she slept every single night. Her husband didn't die of a bad heart. Her husband found something, wrote it down, hid it, and within hours, one night, that's all it took. One single night, he was dead in his chair with not a mark on him, and Gideon Pratt's man is standing in her doorway 6 months later, demanding she hand over the very proof her husband died trying to protect. Something in Temperance Ashford's chest, the something with teeth, the something that opened one eye out on that porch this morning and has been slowly, steadily prying itself further open ever since, finally, completely wakes up. She folds the paper, carefully, the way you'd fold something sacred. Then she gets down on her knees beside the bed, reaches under it, and drags out the trunk's false bottom. The oiled canvas is exactly where she left it, stiff with disuse. She unwraps it slow, the way you'd unwrap a wound to see how bad it really is, and there, dull and heavy and cold in the lamplight, is the Colt Navy revolver Ezekiel Ashford put into her hands 2 years ago on a homestead north of the Gulch and taught her, patiently, relentlessly, to make into an extension of her own steady will. She hasn't held it since the funeral. Her hand doesn't shake at all when she picks it up. A skill nobody knows you have, his voice says, somewhere in the back of her mind, warm and low and gone now. Gone 14 months, but not gone from her, never entirely gone from her, is worth 10 times the one they're watching for. I know, Zeke, she says out loud, to the empty room, to the lamplight, to the folded paper on the bed beside her. I know. She begins, methodically, without a single wasted motion, to clean the gun. Cylinder open. Check the chambers. Empty, of course. They've been empty 14 months, but she checks anyway because that's what he taught her. Always check, even when you know, especially when you know, oil on the cloth. Down the barrel, slow, patient. The same rhythm her hands fell into 100 times on that homestead with his hand steadying hers, except his hand isn't steadying anything now, hasn't for over a year, and her hands don't need steadying anymore. They never shake once. Not through the whole cleaning. Not through the reassembly. Cylinder locking home with a small, decisive click that sounds, in the quiet of that back room, louder than anything else in the whole Sleeping Gulch. She loads it. 6 rounds, brass sliding home the way he taught her, blind by feel, a rosary counted in the dark. Then she sits there a long moment, the loaded Colt heavy and familiar in her hand, the folded paper on the quilt beside her, with 4 dead men's ruined lives written down in her husband's careful, doomed hand. And outside the window, the last of the Gulch's noise finally dies down toward that thin gray hour before dawn. That hour where Deadwood, for just a little while, stops pretending to sleep, and actually, briefly, does. 3 days, Jubal Creed told her. 3 days to bring Gideon Pratt his marker. Temperance Ashford looks down at the revolver in her hand, and at the small, quiet, grateful widow she has spent 14 months so carefully, so completely building. A woman small enough to be invisible, quiet enough to be forgotten, safe enough that nobody ever thought twice about what might be sitting under her bed. And for the first time since they buried Ezekiel Ashford in the cold ground above the gulch, she understands, with a clarity that settles into her bones, like something finally arriving home, exactly what has to happen next. She isn't going to hide the marker. She isn't going to hand it over either. She's going to find out exactly what her husband died for. Every name on that list. Every accident that wasn't. And she is going to make Gideon Pratt understand, in whatever way finally proves necessary, that the quiet widow who does the wash was never the whole story. Only the part he was allowed to see. Outside, somewhere down toward the ridge, the first pickaxe of the new day bites into rock. Temperance Ashford blows out the lamp, sets the loaded Colt on the trunk beside her bed where she can reach it without thinking. And for the first time in 14 months, does not lie awake, waiting for a grief that never comes with an answer. She lies awake instead, planning. One last time, she tells herself, echoing a promise she hasn't made out loud to anyone yet, not even to Micah, not even to the dark. One last time. For Zeke, for the truth, for every name on that terrible list. And then, God willing, never again. Morning comes the way it always comes to Deadwood Gulch. Gray first, then gold, thin and reluctant, like the ridge is doing the sun a favor by letting it through at all. Temperance doesn't sleep. Not really. She lies there in the dark with the Colt on the trunk beside her, close enough to touch, and she runs the 4 names over and over in her mind until they stop being names and start being a rhythm, a drumbeat, something her body keeps time to instead of a heartbeat. Because that's what grief does if you let it sit too long. It calcifies. It becomes structural. And Temperance Ashford has spent 14 months building her whole life around a grief shaped like an accident. A sad, quiet death nobody could have prevented. And now that structure is gone, kicked out from under her. And underneath it there's just rage, cold and organized, waiting to be pointed somewhere useful. She gets up before Micah wakes, folds the paper into a square, small enough to hide inside her boot, against the arch of her foot, where a man searching a woman's clothes wouldn't think to look, wouldn't dare to look, not without starting a fight he isn't prepared to finish. Small mercies. The rules men make about decency can occasionally be turned into armor. She dresses. Plain. Gray wool, high collar, hair pinned the same tight, unremarkable way it's been pinned every morning for 14 months. Nothing about her should look different this morning. That's the whole point. Except something is different, and she wonders, brushing past the mirror fragment, nailed crooked to the washhouse wall, whether it shows. whether anyone looking closely enough would see it in her eyes. That flicker, that waking up. She decides it doesn't matter. Nobody in this town looks at her closely enough for it to matter. That's about to change. She just doesn't know it yet. Elijah Duffy's forge sits at the north end of the gulch, past the assay office, past the last respectable buildings, in a lean-to structure that looks like it might fall down in a strong wind, and somehow never does. Smoke curls up out of the chimney at all hours. The man inside works like he's making up for lost time, which Temperance has always suspected, though never asked. He probably is. She finds him already at the anvil, sleeves rolled, forearms corded with the particular strength that comes from 20 years of hammering iron into shapes iron. Doesn't want to be. Older than Ezekiel would have been. 50, maybe. Face like old leather, left out in weather, too many seasons running. He doesn't look up when she steps through the open doorway. Wash isn't due till Friday, he says. I'm not here about wash. That gets his attention. The hammer stops mid-swing, hovers, comes down slow and careful instead of the usual crack. He sets it aside, wipes his hands on a rag gone black with forge suit, and finally turns to face her. And something in her expression must tell him plenty, because his own face goes still, in a way she's never seen it go still before. Sit down, he says. I'd rather stand. Sit down, Mrs. Ashford. She sits on the bench by the door, the one he keeps for customers waiting on horseshoes, and she doesn't say anything else. Just reaches into her boot and unfolds the paper and holds it out to him and watches his face while he reads it. It doesn't take long. It's not a long document, but watching him read it is like watching a man age 5 years in the space of 30 seconds. His jaw works. His eyes go from the paper to her face and back to the paper, twice, 3 times, like he's checking whether the words might have changed since the first pass. Where'd you find this? Soon in his coat lining. He hid it there himself, the night before he died. Duffy sits down heavy on his own workbench. The paper trembles slightly in his hand, and Temperance realizes with a small, cold shock that this is the first time she's seen a grown man's hands shake since her husband's funeral. You knew, she says. Not a question I suspected. That's not knowing. No, Duffy agrees. It isn't. A long silence. Outside, somewhere down the gulch, a mule brays and a man curses it. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of an ordinary morning happening to everyone in Deadwood except the 2 people inside this forge. Tell me, Temperance says. And so slowly, with the particular reluctance of a man setting down a weight he's been carrying alone. Far too long, Elijah Duffy tells her. 2 years before Ezekiel's death, Duffy had a claim of his own. Not much of one. A narrow cut along the eastern ridge, hardly worth the trouble of filing, but it was his, honestly worked. And some months it fed him, and some months it didn't, and that was the whole shape of the arrangement between him and this unforgiving ground. Then Gideon Pratt came calling. Not in person, not at first. Pratt never does anything in person that can be done through somebody else's hands. He sent a man with an offer, fair on its face, a price for the claim, decent enough that a tired man with bad knees might have taken it and been glad. Duffy didn't take it. The offer came back lower. Then his sluice gate broke, twice in 1 month, in ways that didn't look like accidents to a man who'd built that gate himself and knew exactly how much force it took to snap good oak that clean. Then his mule went lame. Then, one night, 3 men he didn't recognize sat him down at gunpoint on his own claim and explained, patiently, the way you'd explain something to a slow child, that the ground he was standing on had a way of becoming dangerous to work. Cave-in. Bad air. A man could go down that shaft one morning and simply not come back up, and who would even know to ask questions out here, this far from anything resembling law. He sold. Cheap. Same as the paper says. And he was left standing to remember it, because a man who signs quiet and disappears quiet is worth more to Gideon Pratt than a man who has to be buried and explained. I wasn't the first, Duffy tells her now, voice low, eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, somewhere in the memory of it. And Lord knows I wasn't the last. The 4 names. 4 I know of for certain. He taps the paper. There's more, I'd wager. Ezekiel was only tracking what he could confirm. Man liked his facts nailed down before he'd put pen to paper. Careful that way. Careful. Temperance repeats, and something in her voice makes Duffy look up sharp. He never told you. No. Would have scared you. I've buried a husband, Mr. Duffy. There's not much left that scares me the way it used to. Duffy studies her for a long moment. Something shifts behind his eyes. Recalculation, she thinks. The look of a man revising an old assumption in real time. You favor him, you know, he says. Zeke. Not in the face. In the way you're sitting right now. Like you're deciding something and you've already decided it and you're just letting the rest of us catch up. Have I? You have. She doesn't answer that. Just looks down at the paper still open on his knee. 4 names. 4 dates. 4 small, quiet tragedies dressed up as bad luck. Why would he go looking into this? She says finally. It wasn't his fight. He wasn't a minor anymore. We had the wash house. We were her voice catches. Just slightly, just once we were safe. Duffy's face does something complicated. Grief and guilt tangled together, and when he speaks again, his voice has gone rougher. Because I asked him to, he says. Because I was scared, and I trusted him, and he was the only man in this whole gulch who ever looked at me like my claim mattered as much as any other man's did. So I told him what happened to me. Told him I suspected it had happened to others. And your husband, he stops, swallows hard. Your husband said nobody should have to lose everything to a man too much of a coward to steal it with his own 2 hands. The forge goes quiet except for the low tick of cooling iron. He started asking questions, Duffy continues. Quiet ones. Careful ones. Assay records. Claim transfers. Who witnessed what? Who signed what? Who got paid and who got scared into signing for nothing? Took him the better part of 6 months to put those 4 names together with any kind of proof behind them. And then he won a hand of cards against Gideon Pratt. Duffy's eyes come up sharp. You know about that. Jubal Creed told me. Called it a marker. Called it a debt. It wasn't a debt, Duffy says. And now there's something almost like admiration in his voice, threaded through the grief. Zeke told me about it after. The one time he let himself talk about any of it, said Pratt got cocky, got drunk, started bragging at that card table about how easy it was, buying up ground from men too scared to say no. Said it like a joke, like a man proud of a clever trick. And Ezekiel let him keep talking. Let him talk himself right into naming names. Right there at the table, in front of witnesses too drunk or too scared to remember it clear the next morning. Zeke wrote it all down after, matched it against what he'd already found. That's what's in your hand right now, Mrs. Ashford. That's the marker Jubal Creed came asking after. Not a gambling debt. A confession. A confession, Duffy agrees. In Pratt's own bragging words, matched against his own crooked paper trail. Enough to hang him if it ever got in front of honest eyes. Temperance sits very still. There are no honest eyes in this town, she says quietly. Are there? Duffy doesn't answer right away. When he does, his voice is heavy with something that sounds almost like an apology. Marshall Doyle's supposed to be the closest thing we've got. Supposed to be. Go see him, Duffy says. See for yourself. But Mrs. Ashford, and here he leans forward, forearms on his knees, eyes intent, go careful. Whatever you're thinking of doing with what you're holding, go careful. Pratt already killed men over ground before. He killed your husband over a piece of paper. He is not a man who negotiates. He is a man who removes obstacles, and then decides afterward whether removing them was strictly necessary. I'm aware, are you? Duffy's eyes flick, just briefly, to the outline visible beneath her sleeve, where her hand has come to rest, steady, still, not shaking at all, against her own hip, the exact place a holster would sit if she were wearing one. Because that's not a widow's stillness I'm looking at right now, Mrs. Ashford. I've seen that stillness before. Only ever on men fixing to do something a whole lot more dangerous than fold laundry. Temperance holds his gaze. My husband taught me some things, she says, before we ever came west. I'm starting to gather that. Will you help me, Mr. Duffy? The old blacksmith is quiet a long moment, looks down at the paper in his hands. 4 names, 4 dead certainties dressed up as accidents. Looks back up at the small, quiet woman sitting on his customer bench with a stillness in her that isn't the stillness of grief anymore. He saved my whole life, Duffy says finally, low. Not the claim. My life. I'd have put a gun to my own head that winter, if he hadn't shown up when he did. Told me there was a way through it that didn't end with me in the ground. I owe that man a debt I can't ever pay off with iron and coal. He folds the paper, hands it back to her with a care that borders on reverence. Tell me what you need, he says. I'll do it. The other 3 names take her the better part of a single long day, because 2 of them are close enough to answer quickly, and the third takes some finding. Otis Farrow is dead, 18 months now. officially of a fall down his own mineshaft, drunk in the dark alone. A story the whole gulch accepted without question, because men fall down mine shafts all the time. Because it's the kind of death this ground produces. The way a garden produces weeds, unremarkable, expected, nobody's fault. His widow left for Cheyenne within the month, and nobody blamed her for that either. Amos Kettering is dead too, though it took Duffy longer to confirm it, because Kettering had no family left in the gulch to grieve loud enough to be remembered. Found at the bottom of his own sluice, one cold morning, ruled misadventure by a doctor who never once looked past the bruise on the back of his skull to ask what a man falling forward would be doing with a wound like that. 2 names. 2 dead men. 2 accidents that Duffy, watching her face while she absorbs it, clearly expects to break something in her. It doesn't. Not yet. It just adds weight to a scale that's already tipping. The 4th name is the one that finally gives Temperance a living, breathing person to sit across from. Reuben Osei, a freedman, like Duffy's own late brother, who came west after the war looking for the same thing every fool in this gulch was looking for. A piece of ground nobody could take from him, because he'd earned it, honest, with his own 2 hands. He'd struck a decent vein, enough to draw attention, enough apparently to draw Gideon Pratt's. He's not dead. That word lands strange in Temperance's chest. Relief and confusion tangled together, because 2 dead men and 1 alive doesn't fit the tidy shape her mind had already built around Pratt's ledger. He's just gone. Left the claim, left the gulch entirely, according to the 2 men who still remember him well enough to talk about it, and settled somewhere further west, further from any counsel that might have been bought before he ever got a fair hearing. Left his own accord? Temperance asks the man who tells her this, an old prospector named Cobb, who worked the claim beside Osei's for the better part of a year. Cobb's laugh has no humor in it at all. Ma'am, he says, nobody in this gulch leaves a producing claim of their own accord, not unless somebody's made real sure they understand what happens if they stay. Man had a family somewhere back east he was saving for. Pratt's people didn't need to kill him, just needed him scared enough to run. And a man with people to lose scares easier than one who's already lost everyone he had. By the end of that day, Temperance has a fuller picture than her husband ever managed to write down on a single hidden page. 2 men dead in accidents that weren't accidents. 1 man alive but driven off with nothing. 1 man, Duffy himself, alive and staying, having sold cheap under threat and lived to carry the shame of it ever since. 4 claims. 4 different outcomes. 1 identical hand behind every single one of them. Gideon Pratt does not do his own killing, not when frightening a man works just as well and costs him nothing in whispers afterward. He simply makes sure the ground itself seems to do the rest. There's 1 more door she means to knock on before the light gives out, and it takes her longer to work up the nerve than she'd like to admit, because Dr. Aldous Pell is not a man who suffers foolishness lightly. And Temperance has spent 14 months being careful never to look, to him or to anyone, like a woman prone to foolishness. His office sits above the mercantile, 1 narrow room smelling of carbolic and cold coffee, and he's cleaning instruments when she comes up the stairs. An old man, gray at the temples, hands steadier than they have any right to be at his age. The particular steadiness of a man who has set enough broken bones and closed enough eyes that his hands simply stopped being able to shake regardless of what his heart was doing underneath. Mrs. Ashford. He doesn't look up from the instrument in his hand. Wash isn't due, is it? I've got a question about my husband. That gets his attention. He sets the instrument down, looks at her over the rim of his spectacles with an expression she can't entirely read, though something in it looks, for just a moment, like relief, the particular relief of a man who's been waiting a long time for somebody to finally ask the right question. Sit, he says. Same word Duffy used. Same tone underneath it. She sits. You examined him, she says. The morning after. I need to know exactly what you found. All of it. Not the version you told me at the time, meaning no unkindness by that doctor, but a grieving widow asking after her husband's heart is not the same as a woman asking a doctor to account for himself plainly. Pell is quiet a long moment, takes his spectacles off, cleans them on his shirt tail, a small delaying gesture she recognizes because she's used the same kind herself more than once this past fortnight. There was a bruising, he says finally. faint, along the inside of his forearm. The kind you'd get from a hard grip or from steadying yourself against something you didn't mean to fall against. I noted it. Didn't think much of it at the time, because a man's heart failing sudden can produce all manner of small marks. Nobody thinks to explain. And I had no reason then to go looking for a reason beyond the plain one sitting in front of me. And now, he says, and something in his old voice has gone careful in a way that frightens her more than anger would. Now I've had 18 months and 2 more sudden hearts in men who worked claims. Gideon Pratt happened to want, and a doctor who wants to keep practicing in a gulch like this one learns early which questions are worth asking out loud and which ones a man keeps to himself and simply carries. You suspected. I suspected a great many things I had no proof of, Mrs. Ashford, and no court in this territory that would have heard me if I'd tried to say them plain. He looks at her steady now, some old caution finally visibly, giving way to something else. There are tinctures, compounds, things a careful man could put in a man's drink that would slow a heart down, gradual enough that nobody examining the body after would think to look past the obvious. I've no proof it happened to your husband. I want you to hear that plain, because I won't hand you a certainty I don't actually possess. But I've suspected it since the week it happened, and I've been ashamed, every day since, of exactly how little I did with that suspicion. Why didn't you say something? Say what? To whom? He spreads his hands, an old man's gesture, tired rather than defensive. Marshall Doyle, who I already knew answered to money before either of us ever needed to test the theory. The counsel, half of whom owe Pratt some manner of favor they'd rather not have called in. I am one old doctor in a gulch with no real law in it, Mrs. Ashford. I chose, God forgive me, to keep my suspicions and keep breathing, and I have told myself every night since that there was nothing else a sensible man in my position could have done. Temperance is quiet a long moment. There's something else a sensible man in your position could do now, she says finally. Pell studies her. Something in his tired old face sharpens, the look of a man finally being handed the chance to put down a weight he's been carrying a great deal longer than 14 months. Say it plain, then, he says. I'm listening. Will you swear in front of the council to what you just told me? The bruising, the suspicion, all of it. He's quiet only a moment. I've been waiting 18 months, Mrs. Ashford, he says, for somebody brave enough, or perhaps simply reckless enough, to finally ask me to. She leaves his office with one more name added to the quiet list of people willing to stand up in a room and say a true thing out loud. And it doesn't undo a single day of the 14 months she spent believing a lie. But it adds weight to the other side of the scale, and by now she's learned enough about scales to know that weight, patient and honest, accumulated one small brave admission at a time, is the only kind that ever tips one for good. While she's at the doctor's office, Micah climbs the hill above the gulch alone, to the small, rough cemetery where they buried Ezekiel Ashford 14 months back under a marker that still doesn't have his full name carved right, because the man who does the stonework in this gulch charges by the letter and Temperance couldn't bring herself, back then, to spend a single coin more than the plainest marker required. He doesn't tell her he's going, doesn't entirely understand himself why he needs to. Only that something in him has been sitting wrong since the morning he finally told her the truth about that night. Some weight that talking about it should have lifted, and somehow, instead, only shifted onto different shoulders. The ground up here is hard already. First frost coming early this year, and the wind off the ridge cuts through his coat like it's got somewhere urgent to be. He crouches by the marker anyway, doesn't say anything for a long while. Just sits with his own cold hands tucked under his arms and looks at a name that isn't spelled all the way right on a stone that never should have had to be this plain. I should have told her sooner, he says finally, out loud to nobody, to the wind, to a dead man who can't answer him back. I know that. I know it don't fix anything, saying it now. But I wanted you to hear it anyway, wherever you are. However that works. The wind doesn't answer. Wind never does. But something in the saying of it, out loud, alone, where nobody can watch him be 14 and scared and sorry all at once, loosens something in his chest that's been sitting tight since that terrible night. And by the time he starts back down toward the gulch, hands jammed deep in his pockets against the cold, he walks a little straighter than he climbed up. Because that's the other thing grief does, alongside all the terrible things. Given enough honesty, enough time, enough people willing to sit still and hear the worst of what you're carrying, it eventually, slowly, makes just enough room for a boy to keep walking forward instead of only backward. Terrible night, over and over, alone. She goes to see Marshall Doyle the next morning, mostly because Duffy asked her to. Mostly because some stubborn part of her still wants to believe, despite everything, despite 14 months of quiet evidence to the contrary, that there is one honest structure left standing in this whole rotten gulch. His office sits between the assay building and a saloon that never quite closes, a narrow room with a desk too big for it, and a stove that smokes worse than it heats. Doyle himself is a heavy-set man gone soft in the middle, mustache waxed with more care than his badge has ever received, and he doesn't stand when she comes in, doesn't offer her the one good chair, Mrs. Ashford. He says her name like it costs him something. Heard about the trouble at your place. Terrible business. I'd like to report a crime, Marshal. That's so. 4 crimes, actually. Going back 2 years. She sets the paper on his desk, careful, and watches his eyes go to it, and then, very deliberately, away from it, the way a man's eyes slide off something he's already decided not to see. Names. Dates. A pattern I believe you'll find worth investigating. Doyle doesn't touch the paper, Mrs. Ashford. His voice has gone gentle in a way that feels, somehow, worse than anger would. This is a hard town. Men die out here. Mine shafts collapse. Claims change hands. It's the way of the frontier. 2 accidents. 2 claims stolen outright. All benefiting the same man. Coincidence has a way of looking sinister when a body's grieving. I am not, she catches herself, forces her voice back level. I am not grieving my judgment, Marshal. I am reporting evidence. Doyle leans back in his chair. It creaks under him, and somewhere in that small sound, Temperance hears everything she needs to hear about how this conversation is going to end. There's no formal court in this gulch, he says. You know that. No judge sent proper by any government that'll own this ground for another year at least. What we've got is a council, and the council settles matters like these when there's real proof. Sworn witnesses. Not, he gestures, vague, dismissive at the paper still sitting untouched between them. Not a piece of paper a grieving widow says she found in a coat lining. My husband wrote it. So you say? The words land like a slap. Temperance sits very still, and something in her face must show, because Doyle's eyes flick to it and then away. Quick, uncomfortable, the look of a man who knows exactly what he's doing and would rather not watch himself do it. I'll tell you what I'll do, he says, standing now, moving toward the door in a gesture that makes plain the conversation is over whether she agrees or not. I'll keep an eye on things. You hear anything more, you come find me. You won't even read it, Mrs. Ashford. He opens the door. Cold air rushes in. Go home. Look after that boy of yours. This isn't work for a woman alone. And it surely isn't work for a woman with no proof but a dead man's handwriting nobody left alive can swear to. She stands, folds the paper back into its careful square, walks past him into the gray afternoon without another word, because there's nothing left to say to a man who has already decided, long before she ever walked through his door, exactly whose side he's standing on. Outside, in the mud of Main Street, she stops for just a moment, breathes, lets the cold air do the work her voice couldn't do in that office. Steady her. Slow her. Keep the fury from showing on her face where anyone passing might read it. No honest eyes in this town. Duffy was right. Which means whatever justice her husband died trying to uncover isn't going to come wearing a badge. That evening, on her way back from the mercantile, with a basket of goods she barely remembers buying, Temperance takes the long way home, down past the edge of Chinatown, where the buildings lean close together in tight, orderly rows, laundry lines crossing overhead in patterns the rest of the gulch never bothers to imitate, smoke rising thin and fragrant from cook fires that smell like nothing else in Deadwood. She's here on purpose, not by accident, though she'd never admit that to herself in quite those words. Because there is one person left in this whole gulch who has never once looked at Temperance Ashford, and seen only the widow does the wash. One person who looked past that, quietly, patiently, the way you'd look past a fence to see the field beyond it. The apothecary shop is small, neat. Shelves lined with jars whose contents Temperance couldn't name if her life depended on it. And behind the counter, sorting dried herbs into careful bundles with hands that move with the same unhurried precision. Temperance's own hands move through wash water. Stands a woman perhaps 10 years older than Temperance herself. She looks up. Doesn't smile right away. Doesn't smile easily, this one. Not the performing kind of smile the town expects from women who serve it, but something in her face softens, just slightly, at the sight of who's standing in her doorway, Mrs. Ashford. Her English carries the particular careful precision of someone who learned it as a second language and refused, out of pride, to ever let it be anything less than exact. You look troubled, do I? You always look troubled these days, Temperance. But today it sits differently. The use of her first name isn't casual, it's earned. 2 years of small kindnesses traded quiet between them. Herbs for a fever, Micah caught his first winter here. An evening once, not long after the funeral, when this woman sat with Temperance in this very shop, long past closing, and simply let her cry without once asking her to explain why. Her name is May Sun. She's never told Temperance the whole of how she came to Deadwood, only pieces. A husband who didn't survive the crossing. A brother who did. A trade in herbs and remedies that has made her more essential to this ragged gulch than half the men who'd never think to thank her for it. I need to ask you something, Temperance says now, setting her basket down on the counter. And I need you to tell me honestly if it's something you'd rather not be part of. May Sun's hands go still over her herb bundles. Go on. So Temperance tells her. Not everything. Not the coat lining. Not all 4 names. Some instincts still holding certain details close, but enough. Pratt. Creed. The threat sitting a day and a half out from her own front door. May Sun listens without interrupting, the way she always listens. And when Temperance finishes, she's quiet a long moment, turning something over behind her calm, careful eyes. You want to know his movements, she says finally. Not a question. I want to know who's watching my wash house. When? How many? I can't see it myself, not without drawing exactly the kind of attention I'm trying to avoid. But you Temperance gestures, small at the shop around them, at the network of quiet trade and quiet conversation that flows through this part of the gulch, invisible to the rest of it. People talk to you, people who wouldn't talk to me, or to Duffy. You're asking me to spy. I'm asking a friend for help. If it's too much, May, tell me plain and I'll never ask again. May Sun studies her a long moment. Something moves behind her eyes. Calculation, yes, but underneath the calculation, something warmer. Pratt's men buy their tobacco from my cousin's shop. 3 doors down, she says slowly. They talk more than they realize. Men like that think nobody's really listening because the person listening doesn't look like somebody being careful around. May I'll listen, May Sun says. Simple. Final. Not for you alone, Temperance. Understand that. Pratt has cost this town more than your husband. My cousin lost a claim to him 2 winters back, before you ever came to the gulch. Nobody wrote it down in any coat lining. Nobody remembers his name but us. Something in Temperance's chest tightens. I didn't know. No reason you would have. May's Sun reaches across the counter, closes her hand briefly over Temperance's, warm and steady. This isn't only your fight, Temperance Ashford. It only feels that way because you're the one standing closest to the fire right now. Temperance doesn't trust her voice for a moment. When she finds it again, it comes out rougher than she intends. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. May Sun releases her hand, returns to her herb bundles, though something in her posture has changed. Sharpened. A woman quietly recalculating her own week ahead. And Temperance, yes, be careful how you carry that gun of yours. She doesn't look up from her work, and Temperance's whole body goes still. I've seen the calluses on your hands change these past 2 days. I know what that means, even if the rest of this gulch is too blind to notice. May, I'm not warning you off it. May Sun says quiet final. I'm telling you, I see you. Whatever's coming. You're not as alone in it as you think. Temperance leaves the shop with her basket lighter than it went in, and something in her chest heavier and warmer at the same time. A feeling she hasn't let herself feel in 14 months, and it takes her most of the walk home to put a name to it. Not safety, exactly. She's long past believing in that. Something closer to not alone, which, she's beginning to understand, might be the only kind of safety this gulch has ever actually offered anyone. Not the absence of danger. Just enough hands, willing enough, standing close enough, that no single person has to carry the whole weight of a fight by themselves. Her husband tried to carry his alone. She isn't going to make that mistake. Meanwhile, Above the assay building, Gideon Pratt's office sits watching the whole gulch go about its business, and he's reading through the morning's assay reports when Jubal Creed knocks once and lets himself in without waiting for an answer, which is a liberty Pratt allows exactly one man in this entire gulch to take. Well? Pratt doesn't look up from his papers. She didn't hand it over. I gathered that, given you're standing here instead of my parlor with a piece of paper in your hand. Pratt sets the report aside, finally, and studies his gunman with the particular careful attention he reserves for problems that haven't yet decided how expensive they're going to become. 3 days, I believe, was the arrangement. That leaves 2. Jubal is quiet a moment. She's not scared, he says finally. I put a wash pot in the mud in front of half the street, and she didn't so much as flinch. Grief does strange things to people. Numbs them. Wasn't grief I saw in her face, Mr. Pratt. Pratt's eyes sharpen, just slightly, the first genuine flicker of interest he's shown all morning. What was it, then? Jubal doesn't answer right away. Because the honest answer is a word he isn't ready to say out loud. Not yet, not until he's certain, and the word is recognition. The look a soldier gets sometimes, in the field, right before he understands exactly what kind of fight he's actually in. Anger, he says instead. Which isn't a lie, just isn't the whole truth either. Good. Pratt stands, moves to the window, looks down at his gulch with the satisfied air of a man reviewing an investment performing exactly to plan. Anger makes people careless. Fear makes them run. Anger makes them dig in right where you want them standing when the ground finally gives way. And if she doesn't hand it over inside the 2 days remaining, Pratt is quiet a long moment, watching the street below. A woman with a market basket. 2 mules hauling timber toward the eastern claims. Ordinary Deadwood going about its ordinary business, blind to every arrangement being made above its head. There's a boy, he says finally. Nephew, I understand. Living with her. Something cold moves through Jubal Creed's chest, Mr. Pratt. I'm not suggesting we harm him, Creed. Pratt's voice carries the mild, reasonable tone of a man discussing crop rotation. Simply suggesting that a widow with nothing left to lose is a dangerous thing to negotiate with. A widow with something left to lose, however. He turns from the window, and his smile is thin, precise, entirely without warmth. That's a woman who understands the value of cooperation. She's not going to just hand him over. I'm not asking her to hand anything over, Creed. I'm asking you to make sure she understands her options clearly, should this continue past its natural end. That's all. Words. Just words. He returns to his desk, picks up the assay report again. Dismissal plain in the gesture. See to it she understands, gently if the situation allows. Firmly, if it doesn't. Jubal doesn't move right away. Something the matter? Pratt doesn't look up. No, sir, then go, he goes. Down the narrow stairs, out onto Main Street, into a cold gray afternoon that feels, suddenly, a great deal colder than the temperature alone accounts for, and he stands there a long moment in front of the assay building, with his hat pulled low and his hands, for the first time in longer than he can remember, not entirely steady. A boy, living with her. He thinks of a ditch full of smoke, 15 years gone now, and a hand closing on his collar. Up, soldier. He thinks of a trail outside Cheyenne, a wagon, a young wife riding beside a man who once carried 4 soldiers' weight on a body built for one. Ashford, he thinks, and the name lands in his chest like a stone, dropped down a well, falling and falling with no bottom in sight. Ezekiel Ashford, the dead man's widow, the wash house. God almighty. He starts walking, fast now, no destination in mind except away, and it takes him 3 full streets to notice his own hands have curled into fists at his sides, and another full block after that to understand exactly what he's feeling underneath the cold shock of recognition. Shame. Not for anything he's done yet. For everything he's about to be asked to do. 15 years earlier. A field outside a town whose name history will remember for the worst of reasons. Smoke thick enough to taste, thick enough to chew, and underneath it, the sound no man who's heard it ever fully forgets. Not gunfire exactly, not anymore. Past a certain volume, it just becomes a kind of roaring weather, a storm made of iron instead of rain. Jubal Creed is 19 years old and lying in a ditch that used to be a fence line, and he is certain, with the flat, calm certainty of a boy who has simply run out of fear to feel, that he is about to die. His rifle's empty. His hands won't stop shaking long enough to reload it. Somewhere off to his left, his own company is falling back. Retreating in that particular ragged way, men retreat when the order to retreat came about 30 seconds too late, and Jubal Creed, 19 years old, terrified alone, has made a decision his body arrived at faster than his mind could argue with it. He is not going to move. He is going to lie here in this ditch until it's over, one way or another, because his legs have simply stopped answering to anything as complicated as courage. A hand closes on his collar. Up, I can't up, soldier. The voice belongs to a Sergeant Jubal barely knows, a quiet, steady man from the next company over, 24 or 25, already carrying two other wounded men slung across his shoulders like sacks of grain, and he hauls Jubal up out of that ditch with a strength that seems, in the moment, almost impossible. I can't shoot, Jubal manages. Sir, I'm out. I don't need you to shoot. The sergeant is already moving, dragging, carrying, 3 men's worth of weight distributed across a frame built for one. Need you to walk. Can you walk? Yes. Yes, sir. Then walk. They walk. Through smoke thick enough to blind. Through a field gone red-brown with mud and worse than mud. And twice more the sergeant stops to haul another fallen man up onto his shoulders. And by the time they reach the tree line and something resembling safety, he is carrying 4 men's weight on a body built for one. And Jubal Creed walking beside him now, ashamed of every second he spent lying in that ditch, understands, with a clarity that will never entirely leave him, that he owes this quiet, steady sergeant his whole remaining life. Name, the sergeant says. Once they're clear, once the smoke has thinned enough to breathe honest air again. Creed. Jubal Creed. Ashford. The sergeant sets down the last of the wounded men, gentle as he can manage. Exhausted now in a way his voice doesn't show at all. You did fine back there, Creed. I froze. Everybody freezes. Ashford looks at him then, steady, no judgment in it at all. Just plain fact delivered plain. Difference is what you do after. You walked when I told you to walk. That's the whole of soldiering, most days. Nothing more heroic than that. Jubal never forgets the name. Doesn't see the man again for 3 years. And by then the war's long over, and they're both just 2 more restless men, drifting west, chasing whatever's left to chase. And when their paths cross once more, a chance meeting on a trail outside Cheyenne, Ashford leading a wagon with a young wife riding beside him, Jubal Creed does something he almost never does. He stops, introduces himself properly, says thank you, 15 years too late, and meaning every word of it. Ashford doesn't remember him at first, then does. Then smiles the particular smile of a tired man, remembering something good out of a season that mostly wasn't. Creed, he says. You made it then, on account of you, sir. Wasn't, sir. Not anymore. Ashford's hand comes out warm and firm. Just Zeke. That's the last time Jubal Creed ever sees Ezekiel Ashford alive. It is not, however, the last time he thinks about him. Not by a long distance. Because somewhere in the years since, years that took Jubal Creed from a scared boy in a ditch to the most feared name in a lawless gold camp, years that put 2 Colts on his hips and 11 ghosts, or more, on his conscience, he has carried that debt the way a man carries a stone in his boot. Always there, never quite forgotten, rubbing raw in exactly the moments he least wants to feel it. Until a small, quiet woman in a washhouse doorway looks him dead in the eye and doesn't flinch. And something in her stance, her stillness, the particular economical way she holds her ground against a man twice her size, snags in his memory like a burr caught in wool, familiar in a way he can't yet name. And then it's a name in Gideon Pratt's mouth, and then it's a boy, a nephew, living with her, and all at once the whole terrible shape of it clicks together in his chest, like a door swinging shut on the man he's been pretending to be for 3 years. The second confrontation with Jubal Creed happens the way most true turning points happen. Not with warning, not with ceremony, but sideways, in an ordinary moment that has no business becoming extraordinary. It's evening. The wash line is half full, the light going long and orange across the gulch, and Temperance is alone in the yard, pinning up the last of the day's linens when she hears the gate latch lift behind her. She doesn't turn around right away. Her hand instead moves slow, unhurried, entirely without panic, toward the fold of her apron, where a small pocket, sewn in the night before with her own careful stitches, holds a 2-shot Derringer small enough to vanish inside her palm. Witten, a voice says. She goes still, turns slow, and finds Jubal Creed standing just inside the gate, hat in his hands instead of on his head, which strikes her, even now, even furious, even afraid, as strange enough to hold her attention a full second longer than the situation probably warrants. "You've got a day and a half left," she says. "I know that much without you reminding me. I'm not here about the marker." "No? No." He turns the hat over once in his hands, a nervous gesture, entirely at odds with everything the whole Gulch believes about Jubal Creed. "I'm here because I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it. Honest. You've got a strange notion of how conversations work, Mr. Creed, showing up in a lady's yard at supper hour, uninvited. I'm aware how it looks." "Do you?" "A man in my line of work, ma'am, doesn't often get invited anywhere polite. I've learned to make do with the yards I can reach uninvited." That almost sounds like an apology. Almost, he agrees, and something flickers at the corner of his mouth that isn't quite a smile. Isn't quite anything else either. "I've had a great deal of practice lately at things that almost sound like something better than what I actually am. Your husband's name," he says. "Was it Ezekiel Ashford? The wash line, the clothespins, the whole ordinary evening, all of it goes very far away for a moment, and Temperance finds herself gripping the wooden pin in her hand tight enough to leave a mark. How do you know that name?" "Answer the question first." "It's my husband's name." "Was." "Yes." Her voice comes out steadier than she feels. "Why?" Jubal Creed closes his eyes. Just for a second. Just long enough that Temperance sees for the first time something in this feared man's face that has nothing at all to do with menace. "He saved my life," he says quietly. 15 years back. Battlefield outside a town whose name I won't say out loud, because it does something ugly to me every time I do. He carried me and 3 other men out of a fight I'd have died in otherwise. Never asked for thanks. Never even remembered my name at first. That's how ordinary the whole thing was to him. Just another man he pulled clear because that's what decent men do, in his mind, and he never once thought it made him remarkable for doing it. Temperance's hand has gone still on the clothesline. "You knew him." "I knew him a lifetime ago, ma'am, for maybe an hour, and it changed the whole rest of my life anyway." Jubal's jaw tightens. "I saw him once more, years later. Trail outside Cheyenne. He had a young wife with him." Something cold and certain settles into Temperance's chest. "That was me," she says. "I know that now." His voice is rough. "Took me 2 weeks to put it together. Took me standing in your doorway that first morning, watching you not flinch when any sane person would have, before something started nagging at me. And then it was your husband's name in Pratt's mouth. And he stops, shakes his head once hard, like a man trying to physically dislodge a thought he'd rather not be having. God almighty, ma'am. I put a wash pot in the mud in front of the whole street. I threatened the widow of the one man in this whole territory who ever pulled me out of a fire, without asking a single thing in return. The silence that follows is long, heavy. Neither of them moves to break it right away. "Why are you telling me this?" Temperance says finally. "Because I need you to understand something, and I need you to believe it, even though God knows you've got no reason to trust a single word out of my mouth." He steps closer, just slightly, close enough now that she can see the exhaustion behind his eyes, the particular hollow look of a man carrying something he's tired of carrying alone. "Pratt gave the order today. If you don't hand over that marker before the deadline, he's threatening Micah." It isn't a question. Something in Jubal's face confirms it before he even opens his mouth again. "He didn't say it plain," Jubal says, low. "Pratt never says anything plain. But I've worked for the man 3 years, ma'am, and I know exactly what it sounds like when he's deciding to make a threat sound like a suggestion. He knows about the boy. He's going to use him." Temperance's whole body has gone cold, but her voice, when it comes, stays level. "And what do you intend to do about it, Mr. Creed?" He's quiet a long moment. "I don't rightly know," he admits, "and there's something almost like shame in it. I've done a great many things I'm not proud of, working for that man. Told myself it was just business. Told myself the marks I put on this town were the cost of staying alive in a world that doesn't much care whether men like me survive it or not." He looks at her, steady now, something resolving behind his eyes. "But your husband carried 3 strangers' worth of weight on his back through a field of iron and fire because it was the decent thing to do, and never once counted the cost of it. I think about that a great deal, ma'am. More than you'd guess." "That's not an answer." "No," he agrees, "it's not." He puts his hat back on, steps back toward the gate, and for a moment Temperance thinks that's the whole of it. thinks he's going to walk out of her yard the same unreadable man he walked in as. Then he stops, turns back, just slightly. Get the boy somewhere safe, he says, quiet, urgent now, in a way his earlier menace never managed to be. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. I can buy you a little time, maybe. Can't promise how much. But ma'am, Mrs. Ashford, his voice catches, just slightly, on her name, whatever debt I owed your husband. I intend to start paying some part of it back. Starting now. He's gone before she can answer. She stands alone in the yard, washline forgotten, evening light gone the deep gold of near dark. And for a long moment she simply doesn't move, doesn't breathe, doesn't let herself believe what she just heard. Then she does believe it. And belief in this case moves her feet faster than fear ever could. She's inside before the gates even swung shut behind him, calling Micah's name into the gathering dark, and something in her voice, sharp, urgent, entirely unlike the careful even tones she's spent 14 months perfecting, brings him running from the back room with his eyes already wide. Aunt Tempy, let's pack a bag. Small. Only what you need. What's happening? We're leaving. Tonight. She's already moving, pulling the trunk out from under the bed, the false bottom, the oiled canvas, the colt that hasn't left arm's reach in days now. Micah, I need you to trust me, and I need you to move fast, and I promise, I'll explain everything once we're somewhere safe. He doesn't argue. That, more than anything, tells her exactly how much fear is showing on her own face right now. Because Micah Ashford at 14 years old has never once in his life failed to argue about anything. And tonight he simply nods, white-faced, and starts pulling clothes into a bag with hands that shake only slightly less than her own. Outside, full dark is falling over Deadwood Gulch, and somewhere across town, in an office above the assay building, Gideon Pratt is finishing his supper without the faintest idea that the man he sent to deliver a quiet threat has just, instead, delivered a warning. They don't get far. That's the terrible, simple truth of it. The Temperance will replay for the rest of her life, wondering what she could have done differently, though the honest answer, the one Duffy will tell her later, gentle but unflinching, is nothing. Pratt's men were already watching the wash house before Jubal Creed ever walked through that gate. Already in position, already waiting for exactly the kind of movement that flight, however necessary, however wise, was always going to produce. They make it 2 streets. That's all. Temperance hears them before she sees them. Boots in the mud. Too many. Too coordinated to be anything but deliberate. And she has just enough time to shove Micah behind her. Just enough time for her hand to close around the colt beneath her shawl before 5 men step out of the dark gaps between buildings and box the narrow street entirely. 5 men. She counts them, the way Ezekiel taught her to count anything dangerous, fast, automatic. No wasted motion in the noticing. 2 to her left, blocking the way back toward the washhouse. 3 ahead, closing the gap between them and whatever alley might have offered an escape if she'd had 30 more seconds to reach it. No cover. Mud underfoot slick enough to steal her footing if she has to move fast. The moon behind cloud, which helps and doesn't help in equal measure, hides her hands, but hides theirs too. Evening. Mrs. Ashford, the lead man says. Not one she recognizes. Not Jubal Creed, thank God. Though the small relief of that lasts exactly as long as it takes her to understand what his absence actually means. Mr. Pratt sends his regrets that this couldn't wait for morning. Get behind me, Temperance says to Micah low, not looking away from the men in front of her. Now. Aunt Tempy now. But it's already too late for that particular instruction to matter, because the men have already boxed the narrow street on both ends. And Temperance understands, with a cold clarity that settles over her like ice water, that this was never a fair fight to begin with. 5 men against 1 woman with 6 rounds, and a boy behind her who has already lost 1 guardian to violence this year. The marker, the lead man says, stepping closer, or the boy comes with us instead. Mr. Pratt's patience has its limits, ma'am, and quite honestly, I'd think a woman in your position would rather part with a piece of paper than a child. Touch him, Temperance says, and her voice comes out lower than she's ever heard it, steadier than she has any right to feel, and I promise you, every single one of you will regret it before this night is finished. The lead man laughs. It's not a kind sound. Big talk from a laundress. And that's the last mistake he makes before everything. all at once goes entirely, irreversibly wrong for every single man standing in that narrow, dark street. Because Temperance Ashford's hand is already moving. Because 2 years of a Missouri summer, of a patient husband's steady voice, saying again, of muscle memory buried but never truly gone, all of it comes rushing up through her body in the space of a single held breath, and her hand closes on the Colt beneath her shawl with a speed that leaves the lead man's laugh, still hanging, unfinished, in the cold night air. Because the shot that follows doesn't kill him. She's not aiming to kill. Not with 5 men still standing and a boy behind her who will not, lose another guardian tonight if there is any possible way to prevent it. She puts the bullet through his shoulder instead, and the sound of it, the sudden violence of it, freezes every other man in that street for exactly the half-second she needs. The lead man goes down hard, more shock than pain yet, clutching at a wound that hasn't finished, telling him how much it's going to hurt. A second shot, low, deliberate, catches a second man in the leg before he can close the distance, and he folds sideways into the mud with a sound that isn't quite a scream, more a bark of pure animal surprise, the sound of a body understanding damage before the mind has caught up to explain it. 2 down, 3 still standing, and somewhere in the part of her mind that never stopped counting, not once, not through any of this, Temperance registers the number the way Ezekiel taught her to register everything in a fight. 4 rounds left in the cylinder. No time to reload. No cover between here and anywhere safe. For one wild instant it looks, almost, like it might actually be enough. It isn't. Micah, run! He doesn't run. He should run. Every instinct she trained into a lifetime of careful smallness screamed at him to run, and instead the boy grabs a fallen length of firewood from beside a shuttered doorway and swings it, wild and desperate, at the nearest man's knee, buying her one more half-second she didn't ask to buy. But there are still 3 men uninjured, and Temperance Ashford, for all her rediscovered skill, is still only one woman with 4 rounds left and no cover in an open street, and the fastest of the 3 closes the distance before she can turn her Colt on him, and his hand closes hard around her wrist, twisting, and the gun clatters into the mud. Micah, run! This time he does. Fear finally, overriding whatever stubborn courage had him swinging firewood at armed men, and he bolts down the dark street, toward the only shelter he can think of, toward Elijah Duffy's forge, toward help and Temperance, pinned now, disarmed. One arm wrenched hard behind her back, watches him go with something like relief cutting through the terror, because whatever happens next, at least the boy is running the right direction. Feisty little thing, the man holding her says, breath hot and sour against her ear. Mr. Pratt's going to want a word with you personal. I'm thinking, let go of me. Not likely, ma'am. She's dragged, struggling, through the dark streets of Deadwood Gulch, past shuttered windows where anyone watching chooses, wisely or cowardly, not to intervene. This being exactly the kind of town where a woman screams in the night draw curtains closed rather than doors opened, and it's only as they haul her up the narrow stairs above the assay building, only as the office door swings open onto lamplight and a trim silver-templed man setting down his supper fork with an expression of mild, unhurried interest, that Temperance Ashford finally fully understands the shape of the trap she's walked directly into. Mrs. Ashford. Gideon Pratt rises from his chair, unhurried, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin, like a host greeting a slightly late dinner guest. How very good of you to finally join me. She doesn't answer, saves her breath for the fury building white-hot behind her ribs, and Pratt, watching her face, smiles the thin, precise smile of a man who has never once in his life doubted that everything eventually, inevitably, bends to his patience. Where's the boy? He says, still pleasant, still unhurried. Gone. Somewhere you'll never find him. We'll see about that. Pratt returns to his seat, gestures for his men to release her wrists, a gesture of contempt more than mercy. She isn't going anywhere, and both of them know it. 3 armed men, still between her and any door in this building. You could have simply handed over a piece of paper, Mrs. Ashford. Saved us both a great deal of unpleasantness. You killed my husband. The words hang in the lamplit room, flat and final, and something in Pratt's carefully composed face shifts. Not guilt. Never guilt. Not from a man like this. Something closer to mild, faint annoyance. the look of a man being reminded of an inconvenient detail he'd rather not revisit. Your husband, he says, was a careless man who involved himself in matters that were none of his concern. He found out what you did. To Duffy, to Farrow, to Kettering, to Ossie. Something flickers behind Pratt's eyes now. Real interest, sharpening, and Temperance understands too late that she's just told him exactly how much she knows, exactly how far her investigation has reached, and the small satisfied nod he gives, in response, is worse somehow than any threat he's made so far. Well, Gideon Pratt says softly, settling back into his chair with the air of a man whose evening has just gotten considerably more interesting. It seems, Mrs. Ashford, that we have a great deal more to discuss than I originally anticipated. Outside somewhere in the dark streets below, Micah Ashford is pounding on Elijah Duffy's door, with fists gone raw from cold and terror, screaming a name that will, within the hour, set an old blacksmith, a herbalist with a network of quiet ears, and one very conflicted gunslinger into motion. But inside this lamplit office, for now, Temperance Ashford stands alone, disarmed, surrounded, and more dangerous in this exact moment than Gideon Pratt has any idea. Fists on wood. That's the sound Elijah Duffy hears first, before words, for anything that makes sense. Because it's past midnight. Because nobody knocks on a blacksmith's door past midnight, unless something has already gone wrong beyond fixing quiet. And because when he wrenches the door open, hammer still loose in one hand out of pure old instinct, there's a boy standing there gray-faced and shaking so hard his teeth are audible. Micah. They took her. The boy can barely get the words out. Aunt Tempe. They Mr. Duffy. They took her. Slow down. Breathe. I can't. There's no time to breathe. They've got her. They've got Micah. Duffy grips both his shoulders, hard, grounding him the way you'd ground a spooked colt before it runs itself straight off a cliff. Where? Pratt's office. Above the assay building. 5 men. She shot 2 before they got her arm. I ran. She told me to run. I didn't want to, but she made me. Duffy's face has gone the color of old ash. How long ago? 10 minutes. Maybe less. Which means there's still time. Maybe. If nobody wastes it standing in a doorway asking questions that don't matter yet. Inside, Duffy says. Now. May's son arrives within the quarter hour, roused by a runner. Duffy sent the second Micah's finished spilling out of him, and she comes through the forge door already dressed, already moving with the particular efficient calm of someone who has spent years learning that panic costs more time than it ever saves. How many men, she says. No greeting. No wasted breath. 5 that took her. 2 shot, according to the boy. Could be more waiting inside. 2 shot matches, then. She says it flat, certain, and both Duffy and Micah stare at her. My cousin's shop is 3 doors from that assay building. A boy came running not 20 minutes back, asking for bandages and whiskey. Said 2 of Pratt's men caught bullets in a street fight. 1 in the shoulder, 1 in the leg. Neither fatal, both left behind to be patched, from what my cousin could tell. Something in Duffy's chest loosens, just slightly, at that. Because if 2 men are down and left behind, that means only 3 walked her the rest of the way. That means she went down fighting, not quiet, not small, not the widow anybody expected. That should terrify him more than it comforts him. It does both at once. 3 men with her, then Duffy says. Maybe 4, counting whoever's already up in that office with Pratt. 4 against 3, May's son says. If it's you, me, and whoever else you can raise inside the hour. You're not going in there armed, May. I never said armed. Her eyes are steady, unreadable. In the low forge light, I said, me. There's more than one kind of weapon in this gulch, Mr. Duffy, and not all of them fire lead. He doesn't ask what she means by that. There isn't time, and something in her face tells him he wouldn't get a straight answer even if he did ask. I'm coming too, Micah says. No. She's my family, and you're 14 years old. And I promised her not 30 minutes past that you wouldn't be the one paying for whatever happens next. Duffy's voice cracks, just slightly, the strain of the whole terrible night finally showing through. You stay here. Bar the door. If we're not back by first light, don't. Micah's voice breaks entirely now, the brave boy performance finally, fully collapsing. Don't say that. Don't you dare say that. Duffy pulls the boy into a rough one-armed embrace, brief, fierce, the closest thing to a father's comfort this gulch has left to offer him. We're bringing her home, he says. You hear me? We're bringing her home. He doesn't know, not yet, whether that's a promise he can keep. He makes it anyway, because some promises need making even before you know the shape of what it'll cost. Above the assay building, Temperance Ashford stands in lamplight that feels suddenly far too warm and far too bright for the conversation happening inside it. Because Gideon Pratt has stopped performing hospitality. That mask, the trim, reasonable, dinner table courtesy, has slipped now, just slightly. Just enough that Temperance can see what sits underneath it. Something colder. Something that has never once in its whole calculating life considered another human being worth more than the ground beneath their feet. You poisoned him, she says. Not a question anymore. A certainty, arrived at somewhere in the last 10 minutes of watching this man's face, while he talked, careless, arrogant, entirely too pleased with his own cleverness to notice he was confirming her worst fear one casual word at a time. The card game. Something in his drink. Pratt doesn't deny it. That's the part that finally, completely breaks something loose in her chest. Not rage exactly. Something colder than rage. Something with a very long memory. A tincture, he says, almost bored, examining his own fingernails like the subject holds only mild academic interest. Slow enough that no doctor in this gulch would think to look twice. Fast enough that he never got the chance to write down anything more than he'd already written. Mostly. We didn't find the paper, Pratt admits. Searched his effects discreetly after. Never occurred to us he'd hide it somewhere as sentimental as a coat lining. His mouth curves. Thin, humorless. Sentiment. Always the weakness that gets careful men caught in the end. He wasn't careless. No, Pratt agrees. He was decent, which in this gulch, Mrs. Ashford, amounts to the same fatal flaw. Temperance's hands, bound loosely at the wrists with rope one of Pratt's men tied in a hurry, flex once, testing, and she files the small give in the knot away for later. For now, information matters more than escape. How many, she says. All of it. Not just my husband's name. Does it matter? It matters to me. Pratt studies her a long moment, something almost like curiosity crossing his composed features. 7 claims, Mrs. Ashford, he says finally, and the number lands in the quiet room like a stone dropped down a well. 7, over 2 years. Every one of them producing gold that would otherwise have gone to men too foolish or too stubborn to understand how quickly this territory rewards patience and punishes sentiment. 7 men. 7 claims. He corrects, and something almost prim enters his voice, the fastidiousness of a bookkeeper correcting a figure. Not 7 deaths. I am not a wasteful man, whatever this gulch believes of me. 3 men had to die, because 3 men would not be frightened by anything less permanent. The rest simply learned, eventually, to be reasonable, to sell, to leave, to understand which outcome cost them less. Temperance's stomach turns cold and slow, like water freezing from the edges in. Duffy. Ossie, alive. Alive and grateful for it, Pratt says, mild, almost gentle, if it either man the honesty to admit as much. Your husband, Mrs. Ashford, along with 2 others, chose a different sort of stubbornness, the kind that required a different sort of solution. He rises, crosses to the window, looks down at his gulch with the same satisfied proprietary air he wore the morning he sent Jubal Creed to a washhouse doorway, and Temperance, watching his back, understands with total clarity that this man has never once doubted his own eventual triumph. Not tonight. Not ever. Because that's the thing about men like Gideon Pratt. The thing Temperance is only now beginning to fully understand, standing bound in his lamplit office, with her whole future narrowing down to whatever he decides to do next. They don't lose sleep over the men they ruin. They lose sleep, if they lose it at all, over the rare ones who refuse to stay ruined. She intends to be one of the rare ones. I could kill you quietly, he says, almost conversational, still facing the window. Same tincture. Nobody would question it. Grief does terrible things to a widow's constitution. Everyone would say, poor woman never recovered from her husband's passing. Simple. Clean. Then why haven't you? He turns. And for just a moment, something almost like respect flickers across his face. Because you interest me, he says. A woman who shoots 2 of my men in an open street and doesn't so much as flinch when she's finally cornered. That's not the widow I was told about, Mrs. Ashford. That's something else entirely. He tilts his head, studying her like a specimen. I find I'd rather understand it before I extinguish it. You'll have a long wait, then. Will I? I'm not explaining myself to the man who murdered my husband. Pratt's smile doesn't reach his eyes. We'll see. Below, in the dark street, three figures move quiet and fast toward the base of the stairs, and neither Pratt nor Temperance has any idea yet that the reckoning he's so casually postponing is already, at this exact moment, climbing toward his door. Jubal Creed is not among the men guarding the stairwell. That's the first thing Duffy notices. Crouched low at the corner of the building, with Masons beside him and a borrowed shotgun heavy and unfamiliar in his hands. And the absence troubles him more than a presence would have. Because Jubal Creed is Pratt's best gun, his most reliable weapon, and a careful man doesn't leave his best weapon idle on a night this important. Unless something has already shifted that neither of them knows about yet. Two men at the base of the stairs, Mason murmurs, barely a breath of sound. One more at the top by the door. You're certain? I watched from the alley for 5 minutes before you arrived. I am certain. Duffy exhales slow through his teeth. 3 men, then, standing between them and whatever's happening in that lamplit office above. 3 men, one shotgun, one blacksmith who hasn't fired a weapon in anger since a war he'd rather forget, and one apothecary with no weapon at all, beyond whatever she's got tucked into the folds of her coat that she still hasn't explained. May, whatever you're planning, wait for my signal. What signal? She's already moving. Slips out of the alley shadow with the unhurried confidence of a woman walking toward a shop she owns rather than an armed compound at midnight, and Duffy watches, breath caught, as she approaches the 2 men at the base of the stairs with a small paper-wrapped bundle held out before her like an offering. Gentlemen, she says, voice pitched to carry just far enough. I understand 2 of your friends took injuries earlier this evening. I've brought something for the wounds. Infection sets in fast in cold weather, and Mr. Pratt would not thank you for losing men to something so easily prevented. The 2 guards exchange a glance, suspicious, but also Duffy can see it even from the alley, tired and cold, and not entirely convinced that turning away a healer's offered help serves any purpose worth the trouble. We don't need. It costs nothing to look. Mason said, already unwrapping the bundle, and there's something almost hypnotic in the calm certainty of her movements. The particular unhurried confidence of someone who has done this exact kind of quiet, patient work 100 times before in circumstances far more dangerous than a cold Dakota midnight, a salve. Nothing more. One guard steps closer, curious despite himself. That's the mistake. Because the moment his attention narrows down to the small jar in Mason's palm, her other hand moves, fast, precise, a motion Duffy's eye barely tracks even watching for it, and a fine dark powder scatters directly into both guards' faces from a second, smaller pouch concealed in her sleeve. They don't fall, not immediately, but their eyes stream, their breath catches, coughing hard enough to double them over, disoriented and half-blind in the space of 2 seconds. And Mason steps back calm as still water while Duffy and the 2 other men he'd raised, a freighter named Cobb and his grown son, both owing Duffy favors old enough to have accumulated interest, close the remaining distance and put both stunned guards down with efficient minimal violence. Cobb hadn't hesitated when Duffy came knocking, hadn't even asked for the whole story before he was pulling on his boots and waking his son, because Cobb remembers plain enough the winter 3 years back when his own freight outfit nearly folded under him and Duffy extended credit on harness repairs. No other smith in the Gulch would have risked. No note signed, no interest asked. Just a quiet word that a man ought to help a neighbor first and worry about getting paid back whenever the getting back proved convenient. Cobb has been waiting 3 years for a chance to even that ledger. Tonight, apparently, is the night it finally comes due. His son, 18, and built like his father, says nothing through the whole approach, just grips his borrowed pistol a little too tight and follows where he's led. The particular silent bravery of a young man determined not to be the reason anything goes wrong tonight. Ground pepper, Mason says quiet, almost apologetic, catching Duffy's stunned expression. Certain roots besides. Nothing fatal, just persuasive. Remind me never to cross you, Mason. You never have, she says. That's precisely why I'm here. One guard remains at the top of the stairs, and this one, Duffy understands grimly, checking the shotgun in his hands, is not going to be handled with pepper and roots. He starts up the stairs. The shot that finally breaks the tense silence in Pratt's office doesn't come from below. It comes from the doorway itself, sudden and close enough that Temperance flinches despite herself, and both she and Pratt turn to find Jubal Creed, standing in the frame with a Colt drawn, not toward her, toward the guard who'd been posted just inside the door, now crumpled against the wall, with a wound to the shoulder that will heal, eventually, but has taken him entirely out of whatever fight is about to happen. Creed. Pratt's voice carries genuine shock now, the first crack Temperance has seen in his composure all night. What in God's name owed a debt, Jubal says. His voice is rough. Steady, but rough. The sound of a man who has spent the whole walk here arguing with himself, and finally decisively lost the argument to the better part of his own conscience. 15 years overdue, as it happens. You work for me. Not anymore. Pratt's hand moves toward the desk drawer, fast for a man his age, but Jubal's Colt is already leveled, already steady, and something in his face makes Pratt freeze with his hand still 6 inches short of the drawer. Don't, Jubal says. Quiet. Final. You'll hang for this, Creed. Every man in this territory knows your face. Every man in this territory also knows yours, Mr. Pratt. Question's just whether they'll finally get the chance to do something about it. Temperance, still bound at the wrists, watches this whole exchange with something caught tight and disbelieving in her chest. Because she'd hoped. Ever since that strange conversation in her yard, ever since get the boy somewhere safe. Tonight, not tomorrow, she'd hoped, without ever quite letting herself believe it. Hope, she's learning tonight, is a dangerous thing to let live too openly in a heart that's already been broken once. Cut her loose, Jubal says, not taking his eyes off Pratt. I don't take orders from you anymore, Creed. In case that wasn't talking to you. Jubal's eyes flick, just briefly, to Temperance. Ma'am, knife's in my left coat pocket. Easier if your hands are steady enough. They are. Steadier than they've been all night, if she's honest. Now that there's finally something to do, besides stand still and absorb Pratt's cold arithmetic. She works the small folding knife free, saws through the rope at her wrists with efficient, practiced motions, and within 30 seconds stands free, rubbing feeling back into her hands, eyes never once leaving Gideon Pratt's carefully composed, increasingly desperate face. This changes nothing, Pratt says, though his voice has lost some of its earlier certainty. I have men throughout this gulch. Money enough to buy silence from anyone who might otherwise. You had 5 men tonight, Jubal says. 2 are down in the street where the widow put them. 2 more are choking on pepper at the bottom of those stairs, thanks to a woman you never once thought to be afraid of. And the last one's on the floor behind me. He'll live, if somebody bothers to bandage him kindly, which is more mercy than you've shown any man on that list of yours. Pratt's eyes dart between them, Jubal's leveled Colt, Temperance's steady, furious stillness, and for the first time all night, something like genuine fear finally cracks through his composure. What do you want, he says, and his voice, for the first time, sounds like an old man's voice, instead of a king's. Temperance steps forward. The truth, she says, said plain, in front of witnesses who'll swear to it. Every name, every claim, every man you killed to get it, and every man you only frightened, because I think this gulch deserves to know the difference too. And, if I refuse, then Mr. Creed here puts a bullet through the same shoulder. You had your men put a wound in tonight, Temperance says, voice flat, cold, entirely without theater, and we drag you down those stairs, bleeding, and let this whole gulch see exactly what kind of man they've been afraid of for 2 years. Pratt studies her a long moment. Something in her stillness, the same stillness Jubal noticed in a washhouse doorway 2 weeks ago. The same stillness that made a boy's laundry-throwing errand suddenly feel like standing too close to a held breath about to become a scream. Finally, completely convinces him. Very well, Gideon Pratt says, and sits down heavy in his own chair, all the fight gone out of him at once, replaced by something smaller and far more calculating. The truth, then, though I doubt, Mrs. Ashford, that it brings you quite the satisfaction you're expecting. He talks for the better part of an hour. Names, dates, methods. The sluice gate sabotage that nearly broke Duffy. The staged mine collapse that took Otis Farrow. The blow to the back of a skull that took Amos Kettering and got called misadventure by a doctor who never asked the right question. The threats careful and deniable, that sent Ruben Ossie running west with his family before Pratt's patience could turn from words into something worse. And underneath every single account, the same cold, patient arithmetic. Gold in the ground is worth infinitely more than the men standing on top of it. And a man wise enough to understand that arithmetic early has no obligation to feel troubled by the men too slow or too stubborn to learn it themselves. Temperance listens to all of it standing perfectly still, arms crossed, Jubal's Colt never once wavering from Pratt's chest. By the time it's over, by the time Duffy has climbed the stairs with his borrowed shotgun and May's son close behind him, both of them staring at the scene in stunned, cautious relief, Gideon Pratt has confessed in careful, unhurried, entirely damning detail to 3 murders and 4 separate campaigns of theft and terror spread across 2 years. And Temperance Ashford finally has, in her own 2 hands, everything her husband died trying to bring into the light. Now what? Pratt says when he's finally finished. And there's something almost curious in the question, the tone of a man genuinely unsure how this particular chess game concludes. You going to shoot me, Mrs. Ashford? Even the score? Temperance looks at him a long moment. She thinks of the fence post in her yard, riddled with practice shots. She thinks of Ezekiel's voice. God help whoever makes you use it. She thinks of Micah, safe now, God willing, back at Duffy's forge, with a barred door between him and every terrible thing this night could still become. And she thinks, most of all, of the difference, the one her husband spent a whole Missouri summer trying to teach her, between a woman who can kill a man in cold blood and a woman who chooses not to, when choosing not to costs her something real. No, she says finally. I'm not going to shoot you. Something like relief crosses Pratt's face. I'm going to make sure this whole gulch hears every word you just said, Temperance continues, voice hard as flint now, in front of the council, in front of God, and every honest man left standing in this territory. And then I'm going to watch them decide, together, what a man who murdered 3 of his neighbors and terrorized 4 more deserves. Not me. Not alone. Not in the dark where nobody has to answer for it after. The council answers to money, Mrs. Ashford. My money, more often than not. Not anymore, Duffy says from the doorway, stepping forward, shotgun steady despite the tremor Temperance can see in his jaw. Because there's 2 of your men downstairs who just watched their boss confess to murder with a room full of witnesses standing by. Men like that talk, Pratt. Especially when they realize you'd have let every last one of them hang for your orders without a second thought. Pratt's composure finally, completely breaks. You have no idea what you're doing, he says, and his voice has gone thin, almost pleading. This territory runs on men like me, men willing to do what's necessary. You think Washington cares who owns these claims? You think anyone beyond this gulch will ever know or care what happened here tonight? I care, Temperance says. Quiet. Absolute. That's enough. It has to be enough, because it's all she has left to offer this gulch tonight. And somewhere underneath the exhaustion finally catching up with her, underneath the ache in her wrists, where the rope sat too tight for too long, she finds she believes her own words completely. One person caring plainly, stubbornly, out loud, in a room full of people who'd rather not look too closely at what's true. That's how every honest thing this gulch has ever managed started. Not with an army, not with a government 3 years too slow to arrive. Just one person, refusing to let a lie stay comfortable. They march him down through the mud and cold of a Deadwood midnight, past 2 coughing, disarmed guards, and 2 more nursing gunshot wounds in a doorway, 3 shops down. And by the time the small procession reaches the jail, such as it is, word has already started to move through the gulch, the way word always moves through a place with no telegraph and too many idle mouths. Fast, distorted, unstoppable. By sunrise, there isn't a soul on Main Street who has heard some version of what happened above the assay building. Not every version agrees on the details, but every single one of them agrees on the shape of it. That the widow who does the wash walked into Gideon Pratt's own office and walked back out again with his confession in her hand and his best gun standing at her shoulder instead of against her. Jubal Creed does not stay to hear how the story gets told. He finds Temperance the next morning, before the light's fully up, standing alone by her wash line with the Colt Navy resting easy in her apron pocket where anyone might see it now, because she's stopped hiding that too, and there's something in his posture, hat in hand again, the same nervous gesture from that first honest conversation in her yard, That tells her before he says a word that this is a goodbye. You're leaving, she says. Reckon I have to. His voice is quiet, rough. Man like me doesn't get to just settle into a gulch that watched him work for the devil 3 years running. No matter what he does to try and balance the scale after. Some might disagree. Some might. He looks at her a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Your husband once told me the whole of soldiering came down to what a man does after he freezes, after the fear. I froze a long time, ma'am. 3 years. Working for a man I knew in my bones was rotten, telling myself it wasn't my rot to answer for. He turns his hat over once, twice, in his hands. Guess I finally understand what he meant. Wasn't the freezing that mattered. Was what I finally did once I stopped. Where will you go? Don't rightly know yet. A faint, tired ghost of a smile. Maybe that's the whole point of going. First time in a long while I get to decide that for myself, instead of some other man's ledger deciding it for me. Temperance studies him a long moment. Thank you, she says finally. For coming back. For choosing. When it mattered. Wasn't much of a choice, ma'am. Once I understood who I was choosing between. He settles his hat back on his head, and something in the gesture carries a kind of finality neither of them needs to say out loud. You take care of that boy. And take care of yourself. World's got precious few people left in it, brave enough to do what you did this week. He's gone within the hour, riding west out of Deadwood Gulch, with nothing but a bedroll, and whatever uncertain future waits past the ridge, and Temperance watches him go from her porch until he's nothing but a dark speck against the pale morning sky, and then nothing at all. She doesn't know, standing there, whether she'll ever hear his name again. She finds, somewhat to her own surprise, that she hopes she does. Under better circumstances. A long way from here, the council convenes 2 days later, in the largest room Deadwood possesses, the back hall of a saloon usually reserved for card games and drunken arguments, hastily cleared and rearranged into something resembling order for the first time in the Gulch's short, chaotic history. Marshal Doyle is there, seated near the front with his mustache still waxed and his badge still pinned, though something in his posture tonight, small, uncertain, a man who knows exactly how close his own careful blindness came to making him complicit, suggests he understands. His position has changed considerably since the last time Temperance sat across a desk from him. Elijah Duffy speaks first. He stands slow, favoring the knee that's bothered him since the winter Pratt's men came calling, and he doesn't dress up a single word of it. Man put 3 armed strangers on my own claim, he tells the room, voice steady though his hands resting on the back of the chair in front of him are not. Told me my mind shaft had a way of becoming dangerous to work. Told me it real polite, like he was doing me a kindness by explaining it plain, instead of just letting the danger happen and find me unwarned. I sold that claim for less than the wood I'd used building my own sluice gate, and I have spent every year since telling myself it was the sensible thing to do, and I have been wrong about that, gentlemen, because sensible and safe stopped being the same thing in this gulch a long time before I finally understood it. Dr. Pell speaks next, and the room, already quiet, goes quieter still, because a doctor's word carries a particular weight in a place with as few trusted voices left standing as this one. He tells them about the bruising, about the 18 months of suspicion he carried alone and said nothing about, and there's a rawness in the admission, an old man confessing his own cowardice in the same breath as another man's crime, that does more to move the room than anger alone could have managed. I failed these families by my silence, he finishes plain, unflinching. I'd like that on the record too, alongside everything I'm here to say about Gideon Pratt. A man doesn't get to call himself only a witness when his silence was its own kind of participation. Then Mason's cousin, a quiet, careful man who loses his composure only once, near the end, when he speaks his own dead brother's name for the first time in this room in 2 winters. Then 2 other miners whose claims fell to Pratt's patient cruelty over the years. Men who never before had the courage or the platform to say what happened to them, out loud, in public, where it might actually matter. Even Reuben Osie's name is spoken aloud that night, secondhand, through a letter Duffy had written weeks earlier, and finally receives an answer to just in time. A testimony carried across half a territory by a man too frightened to return but not too frightened, in the end, to tell the truth from a safe distance. Duffy reads it aloud himself, voice catching once near the middle, where O.C. writes plainly about the night. 3 men stood outside his tent and explained to him, patient as school teachers, exactly what continuing to work his claim would eventually cost his wife and his 2 small daughters. I am not ashamed that I ran. The letter closes. I am only sorry it took another man's death for anyone to finally ask me why. Then Temperance speaks. She doesn't raise her voice, doesn't need to. She lays out the paper her husband hid in a coat lining, reads the names aloud one by one: Pharaoh, Kettering, and finally quiet, steady, Ezekiel Ashford, and watches the room go silent in a way this loud, careless gulch has perhaps never gone silent before. My husband believed, she says, closing, that a debt owed doesn't simply vanish because the man who's owed it dies quiet in his own chair with no mark to show for it. I believe that too. I still do. And I think, gentlemen, that every one of you sitting in this room tonight has a choice to make about what kind of gulch you're willing to keep calling home. Before the vote is called, one of the councilmen, a freighter named Whitlow, who has sat on that board 3 years without ever once being asked to do anything harder than settle a dispute over a mule, turns in his chair and looks square at Marshall Doyle, still seated near the front, with his badge still pinned. Marshall, Whitlow says, and the room goes quiet in a new way now, a sharper way, and there is a woman standing in this room who brought you evidence of a pattern 2 weeks back, and you sent her home. I'd like to hear you account for that, if you're able, before this council decides anything further tonight. Doyle's face has gone the color of old paper. He stands, slow, and for a moment, Temperance thinks he might simply refuse to answer at all, might retreat behind the same tired authority he used to turn her away from his own office. He doesn't. I made an error, he says instead, and his voice, for once, carries none of the practiced gentleness he used on her that afternoon. I told myself it was caution. Told myself a piece of paper wasn't proof enough to move against a man with Mr. Pratt standing in this gulch. He looks briefly at Temperance, something that might be shame crossing his heavy features. That wasn't caution, Mrs. Ashford. I see that plain enough now. That was fear, dressed up neat enough that I let myself mistake it for judgment. I am sorry for it. I don't imagine sorry buys back the 2 weeks it cost you, but I've no better coin to offer. Temperance holds his gaze a long moment. Doesn't offer forgiveness, because forgiveness isn't hers to hand out cheap in a room full of men still deciding what justice ought to cost, but doesn't look away either. And something in the exchange, silent, plain, settles a debt neither of them will ever need to speak of again. The vote, when it comes, is not close. Gideon Pratt is stripped of his claims, every one of them, redistributed by council decree to the families of the men he ruined to acquire them in the first place. He is escorted out of Deadwood Gulch under armed guard the following morning, bound for whatever thin justice a territory without a proper court can still manage to provide. And the Gulch, for the first time in longer than anyone can quite remember, exhales. The whole town turns out to watch him go, though nobody quite planned it that way, and there's no jeering, no thrown mud, none of the ugly theater a smaller story might have made of it. Just a long, silent corridor of miners and freighters and shopkeepers lining Main Street in the cold morning light, watching a trim, silver-templed man in a tailored coat, all wrong for a gold camp ride out under guard, with his hands bound and his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing, right up until the ridge finally swallows him from view, to look at a single one of the faces he spent 2 years learning to consider beneath his notice. Temperance watches from her own porch, washbasket forgotten at her feet, and feels, watching him go, not the triumph she half expected to feel, and not quite grief either, but something quieter and stranger than either. A closing, the particular hollow stillness that follows any long-carried weight finally, actually, being set down. Marshall Doyle resigns his post within the week. Nobody argues to keep him. Elijah Duffy, somewhat to his own bemusement, finds himself elected in the replacement vote that follows, not because he sought it, but because a gulch full of frightened, grateful men suddenly finds itself desperate for exactly the kind of quiet, stubborn decency he spent 20 years demonstrating without ever once asking for credit. A letter comes in November, carried up from Cheyenne by a freighter who has no idea what he's delivering, addressed in a hand Temperance doesn't recognize until she's already halfway through the first line. And something in the careful, unpracticed shape of the letters tells her exactly whose fingers held the pen. Ma'am, it begins. No salutation beyond that, because Jubal Creed was never a man for wasted words even on paper. Reckon I owe you word that I'm still upright. Seeing as the last thing I told you was that I meant to start paying down a debt, and a man oughtn't saith a thing like that and then vanish without ever accounting for how the paying's going. Found work outside of town in the Wyoming territory. Nothing that needs a fast hand. Breaking horses, mostly, which I find suits me better than I expected. On account of a horse doesn't much care what a man used to be, only what he does with it standing right in front of him. There's a preacher here who lost his own son in the war and has taken it on himself to remind me, most Sundays whether I ask him to or not, that a man's whole life doesn't have to be measured by its worst years. I am not yet certain I believe him. But I've noticed I keep going back to hear him say it anyway, which your husband would probably tell me is its own kind of answer. Tell the boy I said to keep at his aim, and tell yourself, though I expect you already know it plainer than I could ever write it, that whatever this gulch says about you now, they're only just now, seeing plain what your husband saw the whole while. I don't reckon I'll pass through Deadwood again. Some ghosts, a man's better off leaving where he buried them. But I wanted you to have this much, at least. That the debt got paid, best as I know how to pay it, and that some nights, out here under a different sky, I still think of a ditch full of smoke, and a hand pulling me up out of it. And I try to be the kind of man that hand was reaching for. Yours in whatever gratitude a man like me is still allowed to claim, J. Creed. Temperance reads it twice through, alone in the back room after Micah's gone to bed, and folds it with the same careful reverence she once folded her husband's hidden confession, and puts it away in the same trunk, though not, this time, beneath any false bottom. Some things, she's decided, no longer need hiding. Autumn deepens into the first hard frosts of what will become, eventually, a Dakota winter, and Deadwood Gulch, still lawless in every official sense, still waiting on a territory and a government that will take its own slow time, deciding what this ground truly belongs to, settles nonetheless into something a little closer to honest than it managed before. The washhouse reopens within the week. Temperance runs it exactly as she always has. Boil, scrub, wring, hang. Except now, in the quiet hour before the gulch wakes, she takes the Colt Navy out back and drills with it in full view of anyone who cares to watch. And nobody who watches ever again makes the mistake of thinking the widow does the wash is the whole of what Temperance Ashford happens to be. Micah watches most mornings of all. He's there again on a cold, clear morning 3 weeks after the council's vote, bundled against the frost, and when Temperance finishes her last round of practice shots, dead center, everyone, the fence post by now more hole than wood, she turns and him watching with an expression she recognizes, with a small ache, from a Missouri summer a very long time ago. Teach me, he says. She's quiet a moment. It's not a game, Micah. I know that. It cost your uncle everything he had. It nearly cost me the same, twice over, in the space of 1 terrible week. I know that too. His jaw sets, stubborn, and underneath the stubbornness, something steadier, something that reminds her powerfully of the boy's uncle, at exactly that same age. But you taught yourself to be ready, Aunt Tempe, because somebody once taught you. I want the same chance. Not to go looking for trouble, just to never have to stand helpless again, like I did that night in the street. She looks at him a long moment, thinks of a fence line in Missouri, thinks of a patient voice, saying again, over and over, until fear became discipline, and discipline became, eventually, a kind of quiet, unshakable readiness that saved her life and this whole gulch's honest future in the same terrible week. All right, she says finally, and holds out the Colt, grip first, the way it was once held out to her. But we start the same way I did, slow, careful, every single lesson, all the way through, before you ever load a single round. Micah takes the gun with both hands, reverent, careful, exactly the way she taught herself to be. Feet apart, she says. Wait even. Don't anticipate the kick. He plants his feet, steadies, and somewhere behind her own quiet instruction, Temperance Ashford hears faint and warm, and entirely her own now, the echo of a voice she'll carry with her the whole rest of her life. Better than me, it says. God help whoever makes you use it. She thinks, watching her husband's nephew take his first careful, patient shot at a fence post standing in, for every fear either of them has left to overcome, that for the first time in 14 long months, she finally fully understands what her husband meant. Not a burden, a gift, passed carefully, deliberately, from one steady hand to the next, so that whatever comes for this small, stubborn family next, and something always comes, eventually, in a gulch like this one, they will never again have to face it small, and quiet and unready. The shot goes wide. Micah's shoulders slump. "You're anticipating the kick," Temperance says, and can't quite keep the warmth out of her voice. "How'd you know that?" "Because," she says, reloading the chamber for him with steady, practiced hands, "somebody once told me the exact same thing, standing in almost this exact same spot." She doesn't say his name. Doesn't need to. The gulch around them, quiet, cold, finally, cautiously honest, carries it anyway in the frost on the fence post and the steady rhythm of a second Ashford learning, patient round by patient round, to be ready for whatever comes next. Because that, in the end, is the whole of what Ezekiel Ashford left behind him. Not gold, not a claim on any ridge. Just a widow who stopped being small when smallness stopped being safe. And a boy learning, one careful shot at a time, that readiness is not the same thing as fear, and that the debts this world leaves unpaid have a way, eventually, of finding a hand steady enough to collect them. Spring comes late to the Black Hills, later than a man raised anywhere kinder might expect, but it comes eventually, the way it always does, and by the time the frost finally lifts off Deadwood Gulch for good, the wash house has a new coat of whitewash. Duffy insisted on donating out of his own pocket, and Micah has grown 2 full inches, and the fence post out back has finally, mercifully, given up the ghost entirely and been replaced by a fresh one that hasn't yet learned what it's for. Elijah Duffy wears his marshal's badge the way he once wore his blacksmith's apron, like a thing he never asked for, but has decided, since it landed on him anyway, to carry properly. He is not a natural lawman, by his own frequent admission, and the Gulch loves him a little more for the admitting. May Sun's shop stays busier than ever, though now, alongside the herbs and the salves, half the Gulch has started quietly bringing her their worries too, the way people bring worries to somebody they've learned, the hard way, they can trust with more than just their bodies. And Temperance Ashford, 26 years old going on 27, still small, still quiet by nature rather than by necessity now, still runs her wash house at the low end of Main Street, exactly the way she always has. Boil, scrub, wring, hang. Except now the whole Gulch knows the shape of what sits underneath the quiet, and nobody who knows it ever again mistakes small for weak, or quiet for empty, or a widow's stillness for anything less than exactly what it always was. A woman who was taught, once, by a man who loved her enough to make sure of it, that a skill nobody knows you have is worth 10 times the one they're watching for, and who learned, in the end, that there comes a day in every careful life when the watching stops mattering at all, because the debt has already come due, and the only question left worth asking is whether your hand is steady enough, when that day finally arrives, to collect it. Hers was. His memory made sure of that. And somewhere on a hill above the Gulch, under a marker that still doesn't spell his name quite right, Ezekiel Ashford rests easier this spring than he has any spring since they buried him. Not because the ground itself has changed, but because the woman who loved him finally, fully became the person he always quietly believed she already was. That, more than any gold this Gulch ever gave up to any man's shovel, is the inheritance that lasted. Not a fortune, not a claim, just a family, chosen and kept standing steady in the same cold morning light that once found a young widow small and quiet and utterly unwatched, and finds her now, at long last, exactly the opposite of every single thing this Gulch once assumed her to be. Not small, not quiet by necessity, not a woman things simply happen to. A woman, instead, who happened to Deadwood Gulch once, when it mattered most, and left it better for the happening. That's the whole of the story this Gulch will keep telling, long after every other detail fades. Not the gunfights, not the ledger of names. Just a widow who did the wash and turned out, when the ground finally gave way beneath everyone's assumptions, to be exactly as steady as the man who once taught her to be. And somewhere, years from now, when this Gulch has either grown into the town it's always pretended to be, or vanished back into the hills, the way so many gold camps eventually do, somebody will still tell the story of the widow who wouldn't stay small. Will tell it to a grandchild, maybe, on a cold evening much like this one, and the grandchild will ask if it's really true, and the answer, every single time, will be the same steady answer Deadwood Gulch finally learned to give. Every word of it.